my issue over and over and over again is with Heiser, he's saying it's divine beings. He's saying it's gods. He's teaching polytheism. You know what I mean? If we limited it to angels, I'd be okay with that. Derek Kinder's interpretation of Psalm 82 is angels. I'm not calling Derek Kinder a heretic or anything, but Heiser is actually saying a polytheistic theology. These are actual gods.
Unless Derek Kinder, the former wide receiver, wrote a Psalms commentary I don't know about, he clearly meant Derek Kidner, who did write a Psalms commentary I know about. Psalm 82, the gods on trial. Which polytheistic heretic wrote this Psalms commentary? Again, just using that term doesn't make you a polytheist. Now, we're back for part 2, responding to the Christian Road Warrior and Heath Henning, his book, Against Heiser. Now, I've heavily edited these clips because, I had like 8 hours worth of material to go through. I feel like I'm doing them a service by editing down these clips this way. I feel like I'm being fair with the gist of their arguments. In fact, I would encourage you to watch at least one of their live streams, and you'll see I'm being more than fair in what I'm doing here. Now, towards the end of collecting these clips, I actually, just like in part 1, I really started questioning whether I should even respond at all. But I'm going to go ahead and do this, and I've collected some good material, some good quotes. So if nothing else, I think there's some good material kind of tucked away in here. Now, before we actually start responding to the clips themselves, I want something to be in our head moving forward. We need to keep this on the back of our mind. We hit on a lot of this stuff in part 1, but I'm convinced that Henning simply doesn't understand Heiser, or he just refuses to understand Heiser, especially vis-a-vis the Elohim discussion. Like I said in the first video, Henning is stuck in the Enlightenment categories of monotheism versus polytheism. And those debates, Henning will repeatedly go back to this idea. He will make Enlightenment categories the standard of orthodoxy. And he'll even say, and we'll see in a clip, that poly means more than one. Theism means God. So Heiser is saying these gods are real. Therefore, he's comfortable calling Heiser a polytheist. Now, of course, we don't normally mean that for polytheism. Generally, polytheism is not just the belief in the existence, but the actual veneration of the gods. But we'll set that aside for a second. And we'll just go with this simplistic definition here of poly, more than one, theism, God. Therefore, polytheism, more than one God. In fact, the term polytheism, the theism part, comes from the Greek term theos. So if we look at the Greek, the LXX, contrary to popular belief, they don't always translate this stuff as angelos. The Elohim language sometimes actually does get a plural of the Greek theos. So if we take like Exodus 12:12, where Yahweh says he would have victory over the Elohim of Egypt, and it's treating those Elohim as if they're real. That's interesting because in the Greek, it says that that Yahweh would have victory over the theos of the Egyptians, the gods of the Egyptians. And so if we go back to Henning's simplistic definition there, the Old Testament is poly-Elohimistic. It's polytheistic. He's just condemned the Bible as polytheistic, if we go by his simple definition, because it is treating Elohim and theos as real, other ones. So you can't just have that simple definition and move forward, because you're going to, again, condemn the Bible as polytheistic by doing that. He doesn't account for the fact that there are more than one Elohim. Now, he'll pay lip service to the idea he did in part 1, where it's like, well, angels are called Elohim, blah, blah, blah. Well, again, if we have angels, then we have more than one Elohim. And again, we're back to your definition of polytheism. You're calling the Bible polytheistic. Now, for me, I have a category, so did Heiser, the species unique language, the Bible itself. Yahweh is Elohim of Elohim. Well, let's go back to the beginning here and start taking some of these clips.
Heiser, his whole theology seems to be wrapped around how he understands Deuteronomy 32, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yep. is what he calls his Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And if people understand what we mean by a worldview, it is the filter that you view the world through. So when he's starting with a theological presupposition and he's interpreting the Bible through his theological presupposition, this worldview of Deuteronomy 32. But what people may not realize is how very slim his evidence for that is when we look at Deuteronomy 32 itself.
Now, this is something that kind of humors me a bit. I've seen this quite a bit where people will say, Heiser just depends on Deuteronomy 32. Then they'll say, Heiser just depends on Psalm 82. He just depends on Psalm 89. He needs Genesis 126. And then they start going to all these passages, and it's like, wait, I thought he was just one passage. And now you're bringing all these. And then they'll also pivot and say, he sees the divine counsel everywhere. And it's like, I thought he was just dependent on one text. So it can't really be both at the same time. Now, it's not just Deuteronomy 32. I think for him, what he meant by Deuteronomy 32 worldview.
The whole point of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is that any place that isn't Israel was disinherited by God. It's not God's land. It's not the promised land. It's not the land that he chose for himself or his people. That means every other place is under the dominion of something else.
The Septuagint says angels.
Angels, yeah.
We also want to be cautious because when we talk.
By the way, the most ancient LXX actually has sons of God. And I did want to note, I have them, I think, at 1.25 or 1.5 speed. So if they sound fast, that's why.
Talk about the Septuagint. There's really no such thing as the Septuagint. There's multitudes of ancient Greek translations that we refer to as a Septuagint. So even with our common Septuagint that says angels of God, or just angels, you also got a multiple different other Septuagints. For example, Aquilus.
There's at least two things here. It's really downstream from the LXX, and in some cases, maybe even derivative of it. And then also, it's mostly AD era stuff. In fact, because most of this is really preserved via Origin, because he was trying to actually connect all of the texts. Like, he was trying to build this like master Greek text, and he actually spoke Hebrew as one of the very few, or read Hebrew. So he had the skill set to do it. Now, of course, he didn't finish this giant enterprise that he was trying to do. It is actually interesting, now that I think about it, that Origin, when he quotes 32:8, he actually quotes it as angels of God. So apparently, even though he had all of these variants, all these variant text types, he actually saw it as being the angels of God was the superior reading to him. Now, I'm going to flash up on the screen as he goes through this an image that kind of shows what I'm talking about, the relationship between these various text families.
His version read children of Israel. Symmachus, Septuagint, his version reads children of Israel. We have Theodotion, his version read children of Israel. Beyond that, we also have things like the Syriac Peshitta, which reads children of Israel. All of these follow the Samaritan Pentateuch, follows the Masoretic text here, children of Israel. So even in the Septuagint versions that have angels of God, it's not justifying what Heiser's claiming when he's saying sons of God, or even the concept that he's referring to sons of God as divine.
Okay, so there at the very end, he kind of does his Mote and Bailey fallacy thing where it's like, well, even if we go with angels, that's different than the sons of God. Again, he never explains why. They're both supernatural entities anyway. So it's like, why would that really help you here? Now, another thing that was worth noting is, like I said, a lot of these sources, as far as I can tell, I think maybe all of them are AD era, that is Christian era, post-Christian era. And that's interesting because, again, we'll get to it later, and we'll see that the early church, and again, Augustine is in that early church period. And again, he's the one preserving some of these variants. The sons of God, or rather, the angels of God, is all over the place. That particular text type, it's kind of ubiquitous in the early church. So that shows that it was very widespread. And so even though it's not a translation, when they're quoting the text, they're quoting it as reading angels of God. So they're reading a supernatural idea into 32:8. It's not the sons of Israel. So I think that is very important, because he lists all these texts and it kind of sounds impressive, but when the reality is there's a lot more counter evidence going in the other direction. But we'll continue on.
And one of the things that kind of struck me is kind of strange. He set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. And because he said that doesn't make sense because Israel hadn't existed yet. And I'm like, well, how does sons of God in your sense make sense either? Because if it says this is according to the number of the sons of God, well, how many sons of God are there? Is my question, in terms of if you're going to believe that they're angels or some type of divine being.
And for him to say that Israel didn't exist yet, yeah, Israel didn't exist during the Babel dispersion, but Israel did exist when Moses was writing, and Moses was well aware that there were 70 souls that went into Egypt. Moses has no problem saying that. Of course, Heiser has a problem with me saying Moses said, because he doesn't actually believe Moses was the author of Deuteronomy or any of the Torah for that matter.
Concerning Mosaic authorship, this will come up again later, and I'm mostly going to let Heiser speak for himself. But concerning some of the other stuff, Babel, Sons of God, all of that, again, we're going to hit more of this later, but I want to take a look at a dissertation now. So some of you will probably already know where I was going with this. This is the dissertation by Jonathan Dean Parker, Moses and the 70 Elders, and is mostly zeroing in on Numbers 11, and there's some related passages there. But if you want to take a look, I mean, you can find this dissertation online, but I can also send it to you. Now, here, we're just going to really scrub through, and hopefully you'll see why I go in this direction here shortly. But Ramban here has 70 as council of all opinions and powers. So they're really hitting on all of these various passages, like the 70 elders idea. And of course, they're eventually going to connect this to Deuteronomy 32 kind of stuff. So that is, Ramban, sees not only a numbered group of people, but a configuration council. So in his mind, 70 equals a council is more or less where this is going. Now, I'm really just, like I said, I'm scrubbing through. What makes Ramban's move possible here is his assumption that 70 nations of the earth not only have angelic representatives in heaven, but that those same nations were created according to their princes above. And here is going to then quote Deuteronomy 32, 7 and 9. Rabbi Eliezer cites the MT, is then going to cite Psalm 16:6, and Eliezer suggests God cast lots with the angels, and his own lot fell toward Israel. The allotment language you find in the Bible is sometimes literally the language of casting lots, so that's why you see this concept show up in rabbinic and even earlier material, resulting in the allocations mentioned in the dispersion described in Genesis 11, Tower of Babel. Eliezer expands upon this tradition not only to account for 70 nations and languages, but also 70 styles of writing. For Eliezer, and presumably Ramban as well, this event of casting lots among the divine council is demonstratively proven by the use of the first person plural in Genesis 1:7. And so Eliezer points out, it's not I will go down, but let us go down. And so Ramban finds affirmation for a 70-member divine council as connected to the story of Jacob's descendants. For Ramban, Deuteronomy 32:8 testifies to God's choice to predetermine the number of the divine council according to the future number of Jacob/Israel's descendants, which then results in the 70 nations of the earth. And so this is what ultimately Henning and the host are kind of going in this direction. It'll come up again later in the video, is they see this as like not a foreshadowing, but foreknowledge. God looks through the corridors of time, if you will, and he sees the 70 sons of Jacob, Israel, and he separates the nations according to that number. Now, I actually think that there's some problems with this, but I'm not going to go down that yet. We'll look at the passage in more detail later, but we're just noting here that there was a tradition that took a both and reading. And so as we see here, again, Targum Pseudo-Jonathan explicitly does this. So they're talking about the sons of Noah, and they're talking about when he divided alphabets and tongues to the sons of men, he cast lots with the 70 angels. So again, this is Tower of Babel that's talking about. And notice as well, it says 70 angels, the princes of the nations. And so he brings in the notion in Daniel as well, and established the borders of the peoples according to the number of the 70 souls of Israel, which went down into Egypt. So he's connecting both understandings together. He takes both readings and mashes them into one. And here the dissertation then gets into the Qumran material, the Greek, the sons of God, sons of the angels, divine sons, all of this kind of language. But I just wanted to show you this. You can kind of take a both and. All right, so back to the video.
And I should also add another technicality about the Septuagint. The Septuagint, the table of nations of Genesis 10, actually has 72 names, 72 nations identified in it. So if Heiser, when he tries to say the Septuagint identifies this worldview, which actually it says angels and going against his idea, it actually doesn't fit. The Septuagint doesn't actually fit that concept because it has 72 nations dispersed from Babel. I should also mention that he he argues, the way he argues about his divine counsel, these deities, these divine beings, in contrast to angels, a lot of people say, oh, he defines Elohim as disembodied, so it means angels. That's not what he's saying. All right. But what he says is the angels was an office of messenger in the Old Testament, and it became an ontological term in the Second Temple period. So all our Second Temple literature should be using the word angel as an ontological being. But that distinction, he claims, only occurs during the Second Temple period. And that Second Temple period is exactly when the Septuagint was translated. So the Septuagint, on his own discussions, and this is where he self-refutes himself, he deconstructs his own worldview often because he contradicts himself. But the Septuagint, being the Second Temple text, uses the word angels. So according to his own logic, the angels in the Septuagint can't be referencing the same of these sons of gods that he's utilizing to identify with.
He kind of broke my brain on that because honestly, I don't know what he's getting at. I really don't. Other than the fact that he's confusing, again, functional and ontological. It's actually rather interesting because you have in the Song of Moses, the other Song of Moses in Exodus 15, where Moses says, who is like Yahweh among the elim, the gods. At the end of the song, or like at the end of the section, at the very end of the narrative, they go and they camp by, this is obviously after the Red Sea, they go camp by 12 streams of water or something like that. And the place actually is called elim. Now, it's actually not the same word, but your ear would actually hear that term, the term gods in that, which is rather interesting. But they camp by these 12 streams and 70 trees, 70 palm trees or whatever it is, which is very interesting because you have the 12 and the 70 both connected there. It's very Edenic, like it kind of gives you this streams of water, this lush landscape. It gives you that feeling. And I also kind of want to punch in, if I can, you should listen to the whole episode, but Heiser did an episode on the 70 bulls of Sukkot, of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so that's another piece of evidence biblically that you do have this concept of 70 and the 70 attached to the nations.
What she's going to do in her article is she will apply this to the 70 nations, and not only the nations, but the 70 gods over those nations. And her view is that the Israelites, once a year, actually offered sacrifices to these other gods. Okay, and that's the part I'm going to disagree with. I think that there's something else going on here. These are not other gods to worship. They are underlings. They were actually assigned as a punishment to the nations. These are not, this isn't at the level of the Most High, and all that kind of talk. We have the number 70. Again, 70 speaks to the totality of the pantheon. I get this question a lot. What about the other nations that aren't in the Bible? Do they have, other gods over them? Did they get assigned? Like, what about Australia and China? All these places that aren't mentioned in the Bible. 70 is about totality. The whole point of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is that any place that isn't Israel was disinherited by God. It's not God's land. It's not the promised land. It's not the land that he chose for himself or his people. The whole point of it is totality. So the answer is, yeah, all of those other nations are not Yahweh's. And in Genesis 10, it is the totality. If you actually count up the nations, that's what you get. And if you use the Septuagint, you get 72, which is why in the New Testament, when Jesus sends out 70 or 72, it just depends on which text the New Testament translator is giving preference to, the Masoretic text or the Septuagint. It refers to the same place. Now, Sukkot has this dual significance. Let's not focus only on the agriculture. Historically, it commemorates the 40-year period during which the children of Israel were wandering in the desert. What does the desert symbolize in biblical thinking? And this is also recalling the Day of Atonement. Remember, the Day of Atonement has this wilderness theme in it too. Okay, and the Day of Atonement, which is linked to this festival as well, the Day of Atonement has the goat for Azazel sent out into the wilderness. It's not a sacrifice to Azazel. It's because the wilderness is the place geographically as they're wandering through the desert. Where is the presence of God? When they camp, the whole that becomes holy ground where the presence of God is and the people encamped around it. Everywhere else out there in the wilderness is under dominion of hostile gods. Because of their punishment, they become corrupt. Deuteronomy 32:17, they seduce the Israelites into sacrificing to them. You have Sukkot, which celebrates the deliverance from this place, from these entities, from these supernatural forces. Why in the world would they offer 70 bulls to these other entities. They don't need to do that. They were just delivered. Back to Milgram. It is small wonder that Zechariah prophesied that Sukkot would become a universally observed festival, and that the pilgrims at Plymouth modeled the Thanksgiving celebration for their first harvest on the biblical paradigm. Pilgrims actually modeled it after this particular feast. So yeah, we'll give you that it's about harvest, but even the pilgrims, it seems, could recognize deliverance. How about this interpretation? The 70 bulls are offered to commemorate deliverance from the totality of the gods hostile to Israel. It's an expression of joy, not to placate other gods or to kiss up to them. It is to thank Yahweh for deliverance from those gods during the wilderness wanderings.
And so that's where I think that's where I first began to see problems with his theology, how he was interpreting Psalm 82, and then when I looked at how he was interpreting Deuteronomy 32, and then I think what was worse was what he did with Deuteronomy 4.
24. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, huh?
Even if we look at the context of Deuteronomy 32, so notice here it says they have corrupted themselves. They are not his children. Here is talking about Israel and calls Israel his children at verse 6.
I cut so many clips out because they go on this for a long time in a lot of these episodes, is the concept of sonship. Out of Egypt, I've called my son, stuff like that. And nobody's denying that. I mean, that's not hitting the point of contention because people are talking about specific vocabulary, not the concept.
43, and here's a textual critical issue here. Let me grab
43.
Yeah. Masoretic compared to one of the deviant variances of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
We'll get to 43, verse 43 at some point later, but I leave this in here again because notice how his assuming the MT is the proper text and that everything is a deviant from that. It's kind of like what people do with the King James only. They have this concept where it's like they make the King James the standard and then people are changing the text. It's like, well, it's not like the King James was the first English Bible. So realize that they changed the text first. Of course, nobody's changing the text. You're doing textual critical work. And so we're all trying to find what the actual text is. What are the deviations? And as we'll see, the MT looks like it's the deviant text here, but we'll hit that later.
So even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, these variants, his sons, or the sons of God, are consistent with identifying Israel nationally as God's son and not some divine beings. It's an overwhelming amount of times when Israel nationally is referred to the sons of God or the children of God and so on and so forth, or God as their father.
He wasn't careful with that, but and a lot of people I've seen people that are well known say that sons of God, bene elim, is always angelic, and I'm like, no.
Yeah,
no.
That's incredibly erroneous. In fact, Heiser, I have this in the article again. Check it out. Psalm 29. It has the King James translates it as the mighty, I believe, but it's bene elim, which is the same phrase that's used in Psalm 89. So Psalm 29 uses this phrase, and Psalm 89 uses this phrase. And 89 is clearly talking about angelic beings. In 29, I break the chapter down to show the chiastic structure in my article. You can see that, and it's very clearly talking about the nation of Israel.
Okay, let's take a look at Psalm 29. So here we are in Psalm 29. Now, I actually checked out his article because I wanted to see if I thought it was going to be this like really in-depth thing, but he's really just pointing out that we have the term strength show up here, and then strength here at the bottom forms this inclusio, and so he's saying it's chiastically linked here. I have no problem saying that this is in fact a chiasm, but just because something is chiastically linked does not mean that everything is like on this one-to-one equation. So I could find better examples. This is just the first one that came to mind is Psalm 3. So we have this language of salvation, right? So these are the foes of David. How many are my foes? They're rising against him. They're saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him. That is David in God. So there's no salvation for him in God. If we go down to the last verse, so that's the very beginning, the very end of Psalm 3, salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Okay, so I do think, in fact, this is Hamilton in his commentary. And let's see. He has the chiastic structure here, so he does link it chiastically. Are we to then conclude the blessings on the people are those rising against David here? No, that's silly. So just because these two sections are chiastically linked doesn't mean the people are the same, right? That just, you don't have to conclude that. So similarly, I can accept this as being chiastically linked. And then in the center, verses 3 through 9, we have it kind of like an ode to the voice of the Lord. The voice of the Lord is over waters. The God of glory thunders. But here's the thing. We don't have to say that these are the same people at the beginning and end. In fact, we could just as easily argue, and I think it's even stronger to argue, that this is a call to the heavens to worship, and this is a call to the earth to worship. And they are linked chiastically. But it's a call for the heavens and the earth to worship. And why? Why are they to worship? Because the voice of the Lord is over the waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. This is a very divine warrior text. In fact, in a bygone era, people used to argue that this was just brought over from Canaanite religion and that they just basically changed the name Bel to Yahweh here. In fact, here in verse 3, you have the God of glory thunders. It's actually El. And so it has this heavy Canaanite backdrop. Obviously, I think it's a polemic, but I do accept that there is something kind of Canaanite in the backdrop. Of course, bene elim, then if we have that as a backdrop, then clearly this is talking about supernatural creatures. But one thing that's actually really interesting that goes in that direction is something that Hamilton points out in his commentary, and that's this term flood here. It's not very common. In fact, it's very uncommon. It's only used 13 times. Every other time, it's only used in Genesis, and it's always about the flood of Noah. Now, what do you think of when you think of supernatural creatures and the flood of Noah? In fact, the first reference is in Genesis 6. Obviously, we're thinking about the sons of God, daughters of men idea. So it only shows up concerning the flood and here at the very end where the Lord sits enthroned over the flood of Noah, basically. So what would we be thinking in these chiastically linked verses? Who are then these sons of God? And Hamilton suggests they are the rebels of Genesis 6. It kind of follows with some of the themes that David has been setting up preceding this particular Psalm 29. So it's kind of a double whammy to the anti-divine council people, because I actually do think there's something to that argument. But anyway, we will continue on.
Heiser says the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate conclusively that the sons of God is the correct reading of, and that the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, was altered, most likely because of scribal concern about the divine plurality. But there's a few things that I want to point out here. All right, that quote from him, divine plurality. Let's define that word. The word divine means what? Deity or gods. Plurality means what? More than one or many. Yeah. And he likes to use that term, divine plurality, and say, I'm not a polytheist. Polytheist isn't what I'm teaching. But polytheism actually and literally translates poly, meaning many, and theism is a belief in God. So polytheism is a belief in many gods.
We talked about this earlier. Deuteronomy 32:17. So they sacrificed to Shedim, demons. You can go with that translation, whatever. Not God, to Elohim, they did not know, that their fathers did not fear. It's calling Shedim Elohim, gods. Again, we have poly-Elohimism. I don't know how he doesn't see this problem.
Divine plurality is his term for many gods. He's saying the same thing. He's just using different terms. Mm-hmm. So when he says, he's Henning, he's illiterate, he's an idiot, he can't figure out what I'm writing, I'm not teaching polytheism, he knows he's teaching polytheism.
So he's talking about Heiser's original blog post where he just kind of dismissed Henning. Now, some people will say that Heiser, he kind of, you just kind of flippantly, disregarded him or whatever. I have no problem with with Heiser's response there, because the title of Henning's piece was, or at least like the URL is like Heiser's Gnosticism or something like that. Heiser's Gnostic heresy, I think that's what it was called. And then he calls him a polytheist in the actual post. So that's just ridiculous. And so I can understand why Heiser was like, this guy is illiterate. Like, he can't read what I'm writing, because if he did read what I was writing, he would understand it. Now, the thing is, it's odd because he has apparently read Heiser. Although, again, we'll see examples where it's like, I think he just quote mines Heiser. I'm not sure if he's read like cover to cover. I think he's read him, and maybe he's read the whole thing, but he's read Heiser's material, watched his stuff to find things to disagree with. And again, I think we'll see examples of that where it's like, if you had just read around what he's saying, in context of what he's saying, you would understand your critiques don't really hit anything. So anyway, continuing.
and he's expecting his audience to not be aware of this stuff. It's just a semantic game.
Okay, so what you're saying, if I understand Heiser, right? You're saying you believe that Yahweh or Jehovah is the one true God, but underneath him are real gods, more than one plural, and yet you still want to maintain your monotheist. Well, but that's another problem, though. He doesn't really believe in monotheism. Is
Yes.
monolatry? I have trouble with that word.
Monolatry, I believe it is. But yeah, he
Monolatry.
actually rejects monotheism. He says that bluntly.
And he rejects polytheism.
He says we need to reject and forsake the term monotheism. It doesn't describe the God of the Bible.
Right. And I was saying to that, like, I was laughing at that. I'm like, come on. But to me, it's like you were saying, it's almost semantics, because again, see, to me, as a monotheistic Christian, I believe there's only one God, right? And there are no other existing gods. Basically things like that.
Okay, that's an English critique. Say this in Hebrew, not the whole sentence, but just swap in the Hebrew and Greek terms. Are you saying there's no other Elohim? Because you just denied angels exist, demons exist, and a spiritual afterlife. Okay? I don't get it. I really don't get it.
And now there are demons, right? According to the Bible, evil spirits.
Which are called Elohim.
And there are angels, the good guys, but they're not gods.
Right.
But they're not gods. They're not Elohim?
According to the Bible, evil spirits. And there are angels, the good guys, but they're not gods.
Right.
But different, I guess you call classes, if you will, of beings, or spirit beings, you could say, right? But there's only one God. That's my theology. But from what I'm seeing with Heiser, he's trying to say that there's one God, but there are lesser gods, real gods, and I guess demons and angels. Is that kind of where he's coming from?
So what he says, and this is inconsistency within his own writings, he says the demons are actually the disembodied spirits of the giants, or the Nephilim, that died during the flood. So to him, the sons of God that came down in Genesis 6 were actual gods, not angels. And so you would have the creator God, Jehovah, this second tier of gods, sons of gods, watchers. He uses a plethora of different terms to identify them. Then you have angels, and then this odd mixture of procreation from the sons of gods with the daughters of men produce these Nephilim, these giants, and they're when they died in the flood, their spirits were disembodied, and those are the demons. So that's another tier within this unseen realm in and of itself. But he doesn't use the term demon consistently with that meaning, and so he does contradict himself frequently. That's why I throughout my book and throughout these years, I've been saying he's really hard to pin down, because he doesn't use his own terminology or his own definitions consistently. And there's a lot of ambiguity about what he's saying or what he might not be saying at times. Sometimes he uses the word demon to identify the falling tier of gods, these wicked sons of God. So sometimes he'll call them demons as well. So he doesn't carry any consistency with his own definition of his own terminology.
Man, there's a lot going on there, because again, they're not having this discussion in the context of the Hebrew language. They're basing this all on the English. Again, so he's okay with angels and demons. That's okay. But gods is not okay. Why? Why is Shadim and Malachim okay, demons and angels, but not Elohim, gods? It calls them that. So where is the disconnect there? Now, again, the problem is I don't know how they can watch Heiser, read Heiser, and still miss what they're doing. Again, they're loading ontological categories. They're loading attributes back into the discussion. We've been using the human examples of things like, okay, man, American citizen, that applies to the current president. It will apply to the next president. And man, American citizen applies to me. Well, I'm not the president. There's no confusion about that. There's only the confusion when you load attributes into those descriptions. And there is no attribute. There's no political attribute assigned to man, American citizen. Similarly, there's no attribute assigned to Elohim. It's a member of the spirit world. It's somebody living over there in the spirit world. That's what the term means. That's the way Heiser is using the term. Now, you could take issue with his definition, and then go through it, how these words are used. The use of the God of Israel, Yahweh, the use of gods, goddesses. It's used of angels, demons, the departed human spirit. Okay, now account for how the word is used of all those things, and then combat Heiser. But I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I don't like the term gods. It's like, that's an English term. The Bible doesn't know that term. because the Bible was not written in English. So they've just never hit the point of contention. It's frustrating that they go for like almost 10 hours of this and never hit that point of contention. Wild. But all that being said, I do have a couple of quotes here that I want to read from Heiser that will kind of address this, because contrary to what the host said, this is Heiser in his article, Evolution from Polytheism to Monotheism in Israelite Religion, ? This is at page 9. The fact that certain passages in the Hebrew Bible include plural Elohim only constitutes proof for polytheism if one binds the term to a specific set of attributes. This approach has been shown to be flawed. Another quote that I want to read, that this is in a footnote in the Angel's book. We'll just read this one sentence. Though I disagree with connecting the vocabulary of divine plurality with polytheism. Again, for the reasons that we've been talking about here. Having more than one Elohim does not mean polytheism unless you interject attributes. Now, concerning Henning saying that Heiser is ambiguous, okay, and contradictory, the demon language, he's just being so, I just don't know what he's talking about here. Okay, I'm going to read this lengthy quote, but it's a banger. So it really answers basically everything here. I could read this quote and then just go away, because it's crazy how this just hits on all of these points of contention. But here we go. This is at page 49, starting at page 49 in the Demon's book. And this is after quoting another scholar, how varied the Greek term demon was used in the broader literature. Of course, the New Testament is part of this literature outside of classical Greek, but it's still part of the wider corpus of Greek literature. But anyway, Heiser writes, as a result, the Greek translator of the LXX could use these terms without intending the categories of divine rebels in the Old Testament to be merged into one ontological class. So what is he saying here? He's saying that the term is varied enough. It's broad enough, kind of like Elohim. It's broad enough to cover the various groups. It could be talking about the sons of God. It could be talking about the gods in Psalm 82. The fallen sons of God, that would include demons, the bastard spirits, as Enoch calls them. It could be that kind of thing. It can cover all of this. So this is not confused. Heiser's not being vague. Again, Henning is blurring the categories like he does with angel and Elohim. He's blurring descriptions, functions, ontology. He doesn't see that Heiser is actually being very precise in his terminology. He's being so precise, in fact, that Henning just misses it. Now, to Heiser, he says, unfortunately, we have lost the knowledge of the term's range of nuance. Now, sorry, I want to break in again, because Heiser's not saying everyone's lost this nuance except for me. Just listen to me. He just quoted a scholar that he's relying on for this information. So he's not saying, look at me, I'm the only one who sees this. He means people like Henning. You've lost the nuance in the range of this word. Let's recover it. Let's see it with all its resolution, and then we can understand these texts more fully. But back to Heiser, continuing, he says, this has led scholars to drive a theological wedge between the testaments, charging that New Testament writers would not view the gods allotted to the nations as real deities, just demons. This is exactly what the host did. He said, he's calling them gods like that. That's just crazy. Now, we know demons exist, so he just did exactly that. But back to Heiser, the thinking is curious, since a demon would indeed be a supernatural entity. It also misses the fact that the divine plurality language of the Hebrew Bible doesn't point to polytheism, but to rank and hierarchy of other supernatural entities with respect to Yahweh. The driving assumption seems to be that more than one being means polytheism for the Old Testament. This is Henning, but does not in the New Testament, so long as one avoids using a term like gods in any context that might construe them as real. This imaginary line is one that the Greek crosses quite transparently. And he has a footnote here, and he says the New Testament does as well, by virtue of its use of the LXX and other points of connection with Old Testament divine plurality passages. The New Testament writers were not ignorant of the nuances of the terms. They, in fact, use other terminology that shows their knowledge of the demonology of Second Temple Judaism and its differentiation between divine rebels. A term like daimonion was simply flexible enough to apply broadly. See chapter 10. So again, he's not being vague. He's not being obscure. But we'll actually continue with the Heiser quote here. He says, recall that our earlier table indicated that the LXX translates bene Elohim, sons of God, in Deuteronomy 32:8 as angelan theou, angels of God, but uses plural forms of theos elsewhere when the gods allotted to the nations are mentioned. So in Deuteronomy 17:3, 29:26, 82:1, also verse 6. In Deuteronomy 32:17, these gods, Elohim, are described as shadim, guardian spirits. The LXX chooses to translate shadim of Deuteronomy 32:17 with daimonion, but also refers to these same beings as gods, theoi. They sacrifice to demons, daimonios, and not God, to gods, theois, whom they had not known. The vocabulary is neither inconsistent nor confused. There is no effort on the part of the translators to deny the reality of the divine beings allotted to the nations, or perhaps make them less than gods by calling them daimonion. The LXX Deuteronomy 32:17 shows the flaw in such thinking. And by the way, the rest of the quote is actually interesting because he then goes into Psalm 96:5 in the Greek. And this is the passage that people like to proof text because it says the gods of the nations are idols, right? Now, again, unless you want to introduce a contradiction, we have to take that in. It's kind of like an extreme polemic. Obviously, they know that there are supernatural entities attached to these idols, but in the Greek, they actually say the gods of the nations, the theos of the nations, are daimonion or whatever. They call them demons. They say the gods of the nations are demons explicitly. And I mean, this is exactly what Paul says. So again, if they could just read that section and it click, it's like we're done here. We could just all go home. There's nothing really to object to here. But anyway, we'll continue on with them.
Like right here, he says the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate conclusively that sons of God is the correct reading. I'm like, you're kind of just asserting that, maybe.
Yeah, Demons, page 147. First, when we're talking about textual criticism, to say anything's conclusive is really bad scholarship. All right, that's a sweeping generalization, and it's an appeal to authority. Textual criticism, there's nothing conclusive because a lot of textual criticism is subjective completely. I shouldn't even say a lot of it, most of it, the majority, probably all of it. There's a lot of subjectivity to textual criticism. He makes comments with those sweeping generalizations to make it sound like he's authoritative, and he doesn't have to cite any references because everybody agrees with this, but it's really not true.
So they take issue with how strong of a claim that Heiser makes there, but Heiser's not alone in this. So I'll flash these resources up on the screen so you can read along. But this is out of the Encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls, their entry on Deuteronomy. And it's talking about these, again, the textual critical issues, sons of Israel, angels of God, sons of God. The latter, sons of God, is found in the most ancient tradition, a reading presupposed in several early sources and referred to as late as the medieval period. We'll take a look at all this here in a moment. And so this is actually a very well-attested reading. Again, even rabbinic material will take on this reading in places. The forelog, that is like the source, the prototype or whatever, of the Greek is now confirmed by Deuteronomy. It's talking about 4QJ or whatever it is. So again, this reading is confirmed. Oh, wow, this is terrible scholarship, which preserves the phrase sons of Elohim. Again, compare Psalm 82. This is in all likelihood the original reading, as it is more probable that a reference to divine beings was later suppressed for theological reasons rather than it was substituted for the reading sons of Israel. Now, again, we read that dissertation that kind of takes a both and approach. It might not actually be scrubbing the divine plurality issue, but personally, I kind of think it is. But anyway, Richard Nelson, Deuteronomy, in the series Old Testament Library, Nelson actually translates it according to the number of the divine beings. So he writes, this follows 4Q Deuteronomy J and the Greek, bene Elohim. For theological reasons, this was softened to angels of God in the LXX tradition. A similar concern to avoid legitimizing pagan divinities lies behind the MT revision, sons of Israel, which connects the 70 persons of Deuteronomy 10:22 to the traditional number of the nations. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan then refers to both 70 angels and 70 sons of Israel. Sirach 17:17 reflects this verse in the context of the nation's divine or angelic rulers. This is in McDonald's book, Monotheism, page 90. The difficulties of the EMT led a number of scholars to suggest an emendation on the basis of the Greek, which reads the angels of God, all the angels of God. Elsewhere in the Septuagint, the angels of God sometimes renders sons of God. And it was therefore suggested that the LXX forlog read bene Elohim or something similar. This suggestion has been strengthened by the discovery at Qumran of 4QJ, which has that reading. A further argument offered in support of this reading is that the reading in 4QJ explains the origin of the MT's reading, but not vice versa. And McDonald continues on in page 91. I'm not going to necessarily get into this one, other than to note that, again, he, as others, connects it to Ugart, who has, the well-known pantheon of El, and he also connects it to Deuteronomy 4:19 and 29, 25, and 26. And, of course, that'll be relevant later. Gerhard von Rad, in his Deuteronomy commentary, he reads that part of the quote, the number of the sons of God, i.e., he subordinated one nation to each of the heavenly beings who had to take care of it like a guardian angel. In the footnote here, he says the Masoretic text in verse 8 reads, blah, 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 sons of Israel. This text has long been suspect because the LXX reads, according to the number of the sons of God. Now, a fragment from K4 at Qumran has made it as good as certain that the Masoretic text cannot be the original one. This text modified the conception so as to mean that there exists a relationship ordained by God, which makes the number of the nations correspond to that of the sons of Israel. And he cites people who did this. This is the Net Bible. In their notes, they say, the idea perhaps is that Israel was central to Yahweh's purposes, and all other nations were arranged and distributed according to how they related to Israel. C. Driver, for instance, takes that view. A Qumran fragment has sons of God, while the LXX reads angels of God, presupposing sons of El or sons of Elohim, again, bene Elohim or bene elim. Sons of God is undoubtedly the original reading. The MT and the LXX have each interpreted it differently. And they continue on, of course, connected to Psalm 82, Daniel 10, these other ideas. They actually footnote Heiser in this. This is Telford work in his Brazos commentary on Deuteronomy. The Masoretic text reads sons of Israel instead of, with the Septuagint and Qumran, sons of God. The latter is probably more original, of course, sons of God reading. And that this is not exhaustive by any means. It's just what I put together in a few minutes. And so there could be plenty more that I could add to this. And once again, I'll put these documents up on Ko-Fi so you can read the full quotes. All right, moving on.
And so he's identifying there's no two same manuscripts of the Septuagint. All right, so we don't talk about the Septuagint. We use that term all the time, but that's not a reality that exists. There is not the Septuagint. There's a lot of them, and no two of them agree on issues. This is from.
So Henning is just throwing the LXX under the bus. And I find this whole section incredibly naive. And again, I cut a lot out, but he just throws it completely under the bus. He's pulling an Old Testament Bart Ehrman here. Bart Ehrman had a cartoony view of Scripture and inspiration. Then he went into academia, lost his faith, but he retained his cartoony view of Scripture. Henning's presuppositions here they don't match reality. The different textual witnesses are a blessing. We can't just discard the other textual streams. And in fact, as I was looking for a particular quote in Heiser's Angels book, this was actually in a footnote. So it's in chapter 4, footnote 5. And he writes, studies have determined that New Testament writers quote the Old Testament in places where the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are in agreement with each other about 20% of the time. So 20% of the time, there's agreement between the two texts. The 80% where some disagreement between MT and LXX is evident, the New Testament reading agrees with the MT less than 5% of the time. This demonstrates that the New Testament writers use the LXX most of the time when they quote the Old Testament. And he quotes some sources there. So no, we as Christians should not just throw the Septuagint under the bus. In fact, there are streams of the Christian overall tradition that actually consider the LXX the Old Testament over the Hebrew. So it's just incredibly naive to go in this direction. Now, this mikra stuff is hardly relevant, but I want to point to a few things, so just bear with this section. It's kind of brutal to get through, and I had to cut a lot.
from the same book, Mikra, page 375, he refers to the Qumran text of Habakkuk. The word amel, work, in the lema of transposed to ma'el, transgression, in the pesher. The pesher would be the commentary. In light of in this light, we may now add the.
Let me break in here. So again, it's such a bizarre section in this video because he mentions that this is like 4Q, Habakkuk, whatever. The P in there is pesher. Pesher is an interpretation, which I think he either said or is about to say here. It's not a translation. I don't know how to make that point any clearer. What it's kind of doing, what this text seems to be doing, and what they're commenting on is you actually see this a little bit in the New Testament, which is why some people say there's like New Testament pesher stuff going on in certain places, because you have a phrase about it talks about Edom in one particular case in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament it's quoted as Adam, Edom, Adam. Right? You just change the vowels. So you have the D and the M consonants, but if you change the vowels, you can go from Edom to Adam. I think it says like the remnant of Edom, and then it gets changed to mankind so that it goes out to all people or whatever. So it's that kind of thing that they're doing here. And he's treating this as if they're like butchering the text and we can't trust any of this Dead Sea Scrolls stuff because of the stuff. And it's just like, these are two totally different conversations. I don't know why he's bringing
cited passages of Amos 5:27, from my tent to Damascus does not conform with the mikra itself, which reads from beyond Damascus. Okay, so he's talking about Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean, back in the 70s and 80s, and actually apologists today still quote sources from the 70s and 80s talking about how well the Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved. But that's before there was actually public access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Today we know there's something more like 40%, a little bit more, of the Dead Sea Scrolls that don't follow any textual family. Over 50% follow the Masoretic text very, very sharply, very correctly, accurately. But then there's 40-some% that don't follow any manuscript family. All right, this is Louis Feldman.
And we'll take a look at what he says here in a moment.
Use authority exegesis of mikra in the writing of Josephus, which is from the same book Mikra on page 470. He says the Septuagint is the exact opposite of what the Masoretic text was always intended to be, the preserved authoritative text to be copied for future generations. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagints do not have that same concept behind them. They weren't intended to be the perfect preservation of the Bible. That's what people need to understand when Heiser or other textual critics are talking about the Septuagint says this, the Dead Sea Scroll says that. That really doesn't matter. The Masoretic text was intended to be perfectly preserved, and there is very stringent and high standards for copying the Masoretic text.
Now, this is editor me breaking in here. I noticed something while editing that I missed live. Originally, I merely pointed out that we, as Christians, need to incorporate the different textual witnesses into our understanding of the Old Testament. And an Orthodox Jewish scholar in this regard is no different than the liberal scholars that Henning rails against so much. Like in a parallel example, take Alan Siegel. He wrote about the two powers in heaven, this pre-Christian binitarianism. Well, Siegel, who was Jewish, thought it was a heresy. Of course he did. He was a post-Christian era Jew. Post-70 AD, the religion changed pretty dramatically. So he doesn't go in that direction. Anyway, originally my point was more or less, like the liberal scholarship, we take the good information, discard the bad. But I was bothered that Feldman, who was respected in the field of Josephus, would say something so polemical against the LXX. And it was also odd to me that he'd say that in a discussion about Josephus, just some random dig at the Greek. So I looked at page 470 of the book, and Feldman doesn't say that. Henning does. What I mean is, Henning says...
On page 470, he says, the Septuagint...
That gave me the impression he's quoting Feldman in full. But that's Henning's conclusion, mixed with Feldman alluding to a tradition about proofreaders being paid with temple funds. It is a tradition, by the way. Rabbi so-and-so said that. Rabbi so-and-so said that this was the case. In fact, shortly after that, there's another tradition along the same lines of how temple funds were being used that's disputed. And they go back and forth on that. These are traditions from centuries after the Second Temple. Maybe they're true, but even if they are, it's a non sequitur to do what Henning did and accept this tradition about the care of the Hebrew text. Therefore, they didn't care about the Greek. It just doesn't follow. If you look at the screen, the punctuation makes it clear where Feldman's quote begins, but I was thrown off by that clip because, again, he presents it as if that is Louis Feldman's conclusion about the Greek, and it's just not. So this is from Augustine out of the City of God. And he's actually talking about Genesis 6 in context, but he writes, the Septuagint indeed calls them both angels of God and sons of God, though all the copies do not show this, some having only the name sons of God. And Aquila, whom the Jews prefer to the other interpreters, has translated neither angels of God nor sons of God, but sons of gods. By the way, there's a footnote here that reads, Aquila lived in the time of Hadrian, to whom he is said to have been related. He was excommunicated from the church for the practice of astrology, and is best known by his translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, which he executed with great care and accuracy, though he has been charged with falsifying passages to support the Jews in their opposition to Christianity, because supposedly after being excommunicated, he became Jewish. But back to Augustine, we'll scrub down lower. He actually quotes Psalm 82:6. Then he writes, for the Septuagint translators are justly believed to have received the spirit of prophecy, so that if they made any alterations under his authority and did not adhere to a strict translation, we cannot doubt that this was divinely dictated. However, the Hebrew word may have said to be ambiguous and to be susceptible to either translation, sons of God or sons of gods. So the point is, though, they considered the Septuagint to be inspired, and if it differed from the Greek, if it was altered the Hebrew in any way, it was done so by inspiration. So it's actually like an updating of the scripture, right? I think that's a naive view at the same time, but you have to incorporate both. You just can't do the either or thing like that. Now, concerning his other claim about the 40% thing, whatever, again, he's basically throwing the Dead Sea Scrolls under the bus as if they're not some massive find that really moves the clock back to understanding that the texts are not just this fluid, completely fluid thing that they're just making it up as they go along. But anyways, this is out of the Textual Criticism of the Bible. Here they have a chart, and this chart is actually from Emmanuel Tav, who is, it's funny because Tav actually has an article on the Torah.com on Deuteronomy 32:8, and he takes the Sons of God reading, of course. Of course he does, because if you're being really honest with the text, I think that's what you come away with. But here's that table is talking about the low accuracy rate, whatever. But this is how they comment on this. Gentry is critical of this way of presenting the data because it oversimplifies the relationship among textual witnesses and gives the impression that there is less uniformity than is actually the case. By the way, 32:8 would be among these unaligned or non-aligned texts, if I'm not mistaken. So even though almost everybody agrees that Sons of God is probably the correct reading, it ends up going in this. And so if you look at this, you would, again, you have this, this unaligned, that they're just, this is them just making stuff up. This is the category of just making stuff up. It's like, but then at the same time, scholars actually think that 32:8 is what gets put in this category. This is why Gentry is saying, like, and that this isn't a very helpful way of classifying this stuff. Continuing, instead, Gentry says each variation must be thoroughly analyzed and scrutinized for its worth in determining textual relationship. And then he points to a variation, blah, 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 blah. I don't think we need to go into the rest of the stuff, but the point is simply this kind of way of categorizing things, non-aligned text, all this stuff. Scholars in recent years have been like, that's maybe not the best way to talk about this stuff and to classify these various manuscripts. You kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis and not just put it in this chart and say it disagrees this percent of time, whatever. It's not that simple. All right, so next clip.
Conclusion talking about the textual issues. With that being said, we still cannot find any evidence that Heiser's divine council worldview was ever once held in any ancient Jewish or Christian perspective of scriptures. And after that paragraph, I go through a whole plethora of the Christian authors, ancient Christian authors that, they use the Septuagint. They're Greek readers.
Right.
But, and I should say to the audience, out of my book, there's probably a good 1,000 footnotes that are referenced in ancient literature. So I'm dealing a lot with the ancient literature because Heiser is claiming to be the scholar that knows the cultural context and the background, and he's able to interpret the Bible through that. So I'm actually going through all this ancient literature to show that. And not once do we actually find a valid point from Jewish or Christian circles that adapted his idea. He's claiming the ancient Jews and Christians would have understood this because they lived in this cultural context, but none of them hold this view. We can't find that in any Jewish or Christian text. And that needs to be understood. And that's not just a claim that I'm making. I said there's probably 1,000 footnotes referencing the ancient text throughout this book.
I guess to stillman his position first, I think in his mind, because he has the angels gods issue, that dichotomy. I think, and we've hammered this over and over, but I think because of that, in his mind, if the early church is talking about the angels of God, then that's different than the sons of God, which it's not. They're both supernatural creatures. So, no, he's not. Again, that's the Moten Bailey fallacy. He's not actually hitting the point of contention if he falls back to angels is somehow different. So, no, the biblical authors, later translators, they didn't have an issue calling angels, elim, theos. They didn't have a problem with these terms. And remember earlier, though, I said I held off the idea that some of the text, remember, because he read those LXX translations or those Greek translations that had the sons of Israel reading. And I said that, okay, this is AD era. This is post-Christian era stuff, because around that same time, and in fact, going back into the BC era, we're going to have the supernatural reading of either sons of God or angels of God. So this is happening before that era and at that era as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So here we are. Now, for the sake of time, I'm mostly going to scrub pretty quickly through this. I will make this PDF available on Ko-Fi for you to download and read the whole thing yourself. Now, so would the ancients have understood these concepts? I think yes, and we're going to see that. By the way, also, some of these have links. So if you click this, it'll take you out to the text somewhere on the internet. But anyway, so this is Plato, and many others could actually be cited alongside this idea, but Plato says pretty explicitly, in the days of old, the gods had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment. And further down, and they had peopled them, they tended us, their nurslings and possessions, as shepherds tend their flocks. Now, different gods had their allotment in different places, which they set in order. So here he has the idea of allotment, different deities over different geographical regions. This is 350 BC. This is a well-known concept. Again, we'll run into this. In fact, later we get another quote that refers back to these pagan concepts as well. Enoch, I don't put the dates on it, but it is BC. He summoned 70 shepherds. Here we even have the shepherd language as well. Now, this is not unanimous, but most people do accept that this is a reference back to Tower of Babel, the 32:8 idea. He left those sheep to them that they might pasture them. And so the idea, the concept here is that these 70 shepherds are supernatural. Again, this is Deuteronomy 32:8 stuff. Jubilees, 2nd century BC. Moving down here, many nations and many people, and they all belong to him. But over all of them, he caused spirits to rule so that they might lead them astray from following him. So here you actually have one that goes in this direction, which, I mean, that's an interpretive option. You could go with 32:8. What is the proper posture of sons of God to the people? Were they supposed to shepherd them properly, or was this purely judicial punishment God intended for the nations to be led astray by these spirits? Or were they supposed to do a good job? You could kind of go either way with it. Personally, I think that it was positive. The intention was that they would do a good job. Anyway, we'll talk about this later. But over Israel, he did not cause any angel or spirit to rule, because he alone is their ruler. Sirach 17:7, he appointed a ruler over every nation, but Israel is the Lord's own portion. This ruler language and spirit, like for instance in Jubilees, this is their language for angels. Just throwing it out there. Philo, again, he quotes 32:8. He's talking about the Tower of Babel stuff, making them equal in the number to the angels. For as many angels of God as there are, so many nations and species of virtue are there. So some of these are merely just quoting the passage, but for our purposes, that's important because it shows us that this supposed textual deviance is actually not that deviant. It's actually all over the place. Everybody has this reading, it seems. So First Clement, now we're in the AD era. Philo is kind of the pivot point between BC and AD. So Clement says, for thus it was written when the Most High divided the nations, blah, 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 according to the number of the angels of God, Justin Martyr. Here he actually quotes Deuteronomy 32:43. It's been tampered with by one of these text traditions. It's tough to know. Again, we'll hit this more directly, but I produced this to show Justin Martyr had that Greek version of verse 43, which has this concept of the angels of God is included in all of this stuff. Now, this one's very interesting. So this is, again, dialogue with Trypho, who's a Jew, he's Jewish. This is 131. But I shall quote the passage by which it is made known that God divided all the nations, the Tower of Babel. It is as follows: Ask thy father, and they will show thee, thine elders, and they tell thee. When the Most High divided the nations, he dispersed the sons of Adam. He set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the children of Israel. So there we have the MT. And the Lord's portion became his people, Jacob, and Israel was the lot of his inheritance. And having said this, I, that is Justin, added the 70, that is the Greek, have translated it, he set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the angels of God. But because my argument is again in no wise weakened by this, I have adopted your exposition. So here we have knowledge of the textual variant. But this is very interesting because he's saying this is your exposition. Your argument is sons of Israel. Broadly in 131, what Justin is talking about is the superiority of the obedience of the Gentiles. And so I think that what could be happening here is he had this passage quoted to him to say, hey, look how super special we Jewish people are. And Justin's response is, well, okay, first off, the text I have says angels of God. But even if we go with your reading, your privileged position, this is like kind of like Romans 3 and Romans 9 kind of stuff. Even in your privileged position, you are disobedient and we've been grafted in kind of idea. I wonder if that's not what's going on in this passage, this particular part of the debate with Justin. But either way, he shows knowledge both sides of this. Justin, again, in his second apology, so God made the whole world, arranged the heavenly elements. He appointed this divine law, committed the care of men and all things under heaven to angels, whom he appointed over them. But the angels transgressed this appointment and were captivated by love of women and begat children, who are those that are called demons. And besides, so on and so forth, he gets into the magical writings, gets into the kind of Enochic stuff. But here he actually is connecting both Deuteronomy 32 and Genesis 6. So clearly he knows about this stuff. Novation, again, he quotes Deuteronomy and then says, angels of God. Origin, again, Celsus. Chapter 8, he quotes it again, number of the angels of God. And he's asking the question of why the Advent happened when it happened. Why did Jesus show up when he did? And he's always talking about the nations being under the dominion of these angels of God. But here, this other one is actually very interesting. So again, this is against Celsus, chapter 29. He says, it appears to me indeed that Celsus has misunderstood some of the deeper reasons relating to the arrangement of terrestrial affairs, some of which are touched upon even in Grecian history, when certain of those who are considered to be gods are introduced as having contended with each other about the possession of Attica. While in the writings of the Greek poets, blah, 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 the gods are represented as acknowledging that certain places preferred by them before others. Again, other barbarian nations, Egypt, allusions to division of so-called Egyptian homes, Athena, obtained by lot. So again, we have this idea of allotment, like literal lots being cast for geographical regions among the pagan deities. And the learned among the Egyptians can enumerate innumerable instances of this kind, although I did not know whether they include the Jews and their country in this division. And so far as testimonies outside of the word of God bearing on this point are concerned, enough has been adduced for the present. In other words, we looked at enough pagan sources that talk about this. We say, moreover, that our prophet of God, the servant of Moses, in the book Deuteronomy, blah, 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 he divided them according to the number of the angels of God. The same Moses, and then he goes on talking about the Tower of Babel. So he's connecting clearly this concept that we saw all the way back with Plato. He's saying, well, we have our version of this, and it's this. So he is reading this the way Heiser did. I don't know what else to say. So Victorinus, this is a commentary on the Apocalypse. And he says, because to every nation is sent an angel, as said in the law. And then, of course, Deuteronomy 32:8, according to the number of the angels of God, Christostom. This is interesting because he actually gets into the head veil issue. A woman ought to have a power on her head because of the angels, and Moses set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the angels of God. But here, he is discoursing not of angels only, but rather of angels that are greater than others, archangels. So there's hierarchy among the angelic host. Isn't that interesting? Sounds like somebody I know. Rufinus, a commentary on the Apostles' Creed. This is in 340, but this sounds a lot like Heiser. He says, he set over it and appointed certain powers of celestial virtues. That almost sounds like Philo. And so you could be like, oh, he's not talking about supernatural entities. Well, he is, because then he says in the Song of Moses and Deuteronomy, he quotes angels of God. But some of these angels, as he who is called the prince of this world, so Satan, did not exercise the power which God had committed to them according to the laws by which they had received it, nor did they teach mankind to obey God's commandments, but taught them rather to follow their own perverse guidance. So here, this is Rufinus, is taking the opposite view of Sirach, what we looked at. Because remember, Sirach gave the implication that the giving over the nations was basically to mislead them. It was like purely judicial punishment. And I said, to me, it's more ambiguous, and I think it was more positive. They were supposed to do a good job, but they become corrupted along the way. But now, after quoting this Deuteronomy 32:8 stuff, he then immediately pivots and says, thus we were brought under the bonds of sin, because as the prophet saith, we were sold under our sins, for every man, when he yields to lust, is receiving the purchase money of his soul. Under that bond, and every man was held by those most wicked rulers, which same bond Christ, when he came, tore down and stripped them of this their power. This Paul signifies under a great mystery when he says of him, he destroyed the handwriting which was against us, nailing it to his cross, and led away principalities and powers, triumphing over them in himself. Those rulers then whom God had set over mankind, having become contumacious and tyrannical, took in hand to assail the man, blah, 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 so on and so forth. So point is, he talks about Deuteronomy 32:8, and then immediately pivots to the incarnation, the triumphing of Christ over the powers at the cross, over the wicked rulers, and these rulers have been overturned. Their power over mankind has been revoked. I mean, this is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. This is what Heiser is talking about, and it's right here in 340. So this idea, nobody saw it like this. Well, sorry. Yes, they did. This is Jerome again. He's talking about, this is a commentary on Daniel, so it's talking about like the Prince of Persia, that kind of idea. He said, in accordance with what we read in Deuteronomy. And these are also the princes whom Paul speaks of, about none of the princes of this world knew. So he's talking about that concept of the messianic secret. Severian of Gabala, again, quotes Babel, Deuteronomy 32:8, God set the boundaries, blah, blah, blah. Number of the angels of God. Cyril of Alexandria, in a commentary on John in 376, or 376 to 444. Those are his life dates. But of course, he quotes verse 8 as reading angels of God. And here he's talking actually about Christ's ministry to Israel, basically. But he says, I am not sent unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but when he was not received, he transfers the grace to the Gentiles, right? So he understands this. God set apart Israel for himself. The nations were put under the heavenly host, but that was for a time. Now that the Messiah was rejected, the grace goes out to the Gentiles. It's this grand reversal idea. So Theodoret as well, he's talking about the guardian angel concept. We learn from these passages that each of the angels is entrusted with our care to guard and protect us and to ward off the wicked demons' plots. But the archangels are entrusted with authority over nations, and blessed Daniel agrees with them. So he understands all of this stuff. Pseudo Dionysius, circa 500, in his celestial hierarchy, says Michael is called the ruler of the Jewish people, and other angels are described as rulers of other nations, for the Most High has established, blah, 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 number of his angels. So he quotes Deuteronomy 32:8. This is an apocryphal work, the Apocalypse of John, the theologian. For our purposes here, we'll merely note that he quotes the angels of God. Now we're getting into Jewish stuff. So this is Barakot, 400 to 600 AD. In the heavenly entourage of angels, each who ministers to a specific nation. See Daniel 10. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. The dates vary wildly from when this may have been written. But again, we already saw this. he goes down with the 70 angels. They cast lots for who gets what. And of course, he connects this also to the souls that go down into Egypt. Again, Rabbi Eleazar, we saw this as well. Let us go down. They cast lots. The 70 angels over the 70 nations, the 70 languages. Chabarit. Now we're all the way up to like the 1600s. God chose us from all the other 70 nations to be our God and chose us to be his people. He gave the other 70 nations their respective languages and countries, all under the supervision of 70 representatives at the celestial court. Our tongue, however, is a holy tongue. And then here we get another reference in the late 1600s. This is a reference to the time when God assigned guardian angels for the various Gentile nations to represent them at the celestial court. This is an allusion to the fact that God considered these nations as inferior, so that he did not want to relate to them directly, but only by means of an intermediary. Of course, that isn't what happens at all in the narrative. The narrative is it's not because they're inferior, it's because they're disobedient. And similarly, the ingrafting of the Gentiles isn't because Israel's necessarily inferior, it's because they're disobedient. So yeah, this is just, I don't, this reading is funny to me because it's not based on the Bible at all. But there we are. Quick overview, relatively speaking. This idea is well known, and it continues into the rabbinic age, which is funny. I think I cut it out of the video, but Henning at one point is talking about this stuff. In fact, he's talking about the dates of some of these works, and some of these are well into the AD period, and is saying that, according to Heiser, they didn't stop being polytheists until way later, rabbinic age and whatever. And the funny thing, though, is it's kind of an own goal, because he's making the argument that here are all these other texts, these late texts. Like, for instance, here we're seeing the Jewish rabbis in the 1600s still talking about this stuff. So you see that contradicts Heiser. Heiser's wrong about this. And I'm like, buddy, do you not see what's going on here? You're making Heiser's argument stronger for him, because you're saying this still never went away. It was always there. Even in the traditions that had a different text, they still maintained this idea somewhere. And so it's like, you're not hurting Heiser's case. You're making his case for him, and you're making it even stronger by appealing to these texts, saying these are late texts. They still have a divine council in the 1600s. Cool. Thanks for that argument. It's like you're not, it's like he's so desperate for a win against Heiser that he's willing to go here with it, which is just funny to me. But let us continue. Is it back to the video? Deuteronomy 4.
He's just like he took Psalm 82 and connected it inaccurately with Psalm 89. He takes Psalm 32 and connects it inaccurately with Deuteronomy 4.
Yeah. He said something that was really, puzzling to me, and I just wanted to. Lest you lift your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun, moon, and stars. And one of the things I remember when I first looked at this, and I think you pointed it out too, it says when you see, usually divine beings are not seeing those, right?
Yeah. He calls them disembodied in the unseen realm, right?
Okay. I'd take your word for it because I haven't read that book yet, but so I said, okay, you see the sun, moon, stars, all the hosts of heaven. You feel driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord your God has given to all the peoples under the whole heaven as a heritage. And this was what tripped me out. Clearly, this is talking about the heavenly bodies being the host of heaven. Okay. And somehow he got to divine beings. Do you know how he got there? I don't know.
He uses the phrase host of heavens. The host of heavens, we see frequently, for example, Jehovah's called the God of hosts or the God of armies. That's basically what the word means. So a lot of, he uses the term host of heavens here is identifying the divine council. The same problem, of course, here's a divine council that's supposed to be unseen in their spiritual realm, and they're disembodied beings, not physical entities that you can look at. You can see the sun, moon, and stars, and,
they're symbols. It's not that difficult.
The whole host of heavens, which would include like asteroids and comets and whatever else, moons. And,
right.
And it also tells us that all the peoples under the whole heaven as a heritage. So all the people, all the nations, all these Gentiles can look up and see, right? So these divine councils aren't omnipresent. How do people on the opposite side of the earth look up to the heavens and see the same, these gods that aren't even supposed to be visible? He has a lot of problems with that.
That comment, I have no idea what's going on there. They can see them because we all have the same sky. Does he think that each nation has a different sun, a different moon? No, we have the same sky. Like, for a second, I was like, is this a flat earth argument? But I was like, no, not even the flat earth people would argue that. So honestly, that is bizarre. Like, what? I really don't get that.
heaven sometimes can mean heavenly beings, maybe angels. But it's right there in black and white. You talk about the sun, the moon, and the stars, and that is being spoken of as all the hosts of heaven. You feel driven to worship them. So yeah, that's what really got me when I was like, Heiser, take a hermeneutics class.
So once again, very quickly, I put something together for us to look through. Again, Heiser is not the only person who's seeing this connection, because all you have to do is look at these passages. I mean, 32:8, and then of course there are other passages even within 32, like verse 17, verse 43, and even within that there's even others. But 4:19, 17:3, 29, 25, and 26. 32:8. You look at these in conjunction and you get a pretty consistent picture. But here are some commentaries commenting on Deuteronomy 4:19. So this is Dwayne Christensen in his Word Biblical Commentary. By the way, Christensen is one of the very few commentators that is aware of Labuschagne's stuff, like the number stuff, and he incorporates it. So that's actually pretty cool. But he writes in this commentary, another warning concerns the worship of the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven. In other religions of the ancient Near East, the sun, the moon, and the stars were considered deities worthy of worship. And then he says, if Yahweh has allotted the host of the heavens to the other nations, he has done something extraordinary so far as Israel is concerned. Richard Nelson, in his commentary, page 67, is saying after the Decalogue stuff about idolatry, the astral gods of foreign peoples. This topic is coordinated with verse 16, blah, blah, blah. The issue is not images of these heavenly powers, but the worship of heavenly bodies as directly observed in open air cults. Tige, in his Deuteronomy commentary, this is for the JPS, the Torah series, and Tige is kind of interesting because he mentions here this excursus 31. He seems to struggle with taking this stuff at face value and like how that doesn't become polytheism. He's kind of like where Henning is at in a way. Now, I think he's honest with the material, but he seems to kind of struggle with that. And it's like, just look at the way the term's being used. Elohim, again, is not about attributes. As long as you decouple it from that conversation, it's actually pretty straightforward. But he wrote in his commentary, the worship of celestial deities was common in the ancient Near East. The Bible itself personifies the heavenly bodies as God's servants. It includes them among the divine beings. It speaks of them as dominating, literally ruling, the day and night. The biblical context makes it clear that that these bodies are subordinate to the Lord and depend on him. For example, Psalm 74:16. But people were not always so discriminating, and some Israelites did worship them, particularly in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. He assigned these to the other peoples as objects of worship, but he took Israel to be his own worshipers. The concept that the Lord divided the peoples of the world between himself and other heavenly beings is reminiscent of Deuteronomy 32:8-9, according to the reading of a manuscript from Qumran and the Septuagint. So again, it's not incorrectly connecting these passages. Again, other people see this connection. This is not just Heiser that's seeing the connection there. And we'll move on. This is, I think it's Daryl Hannah. Is it Daryl? Isn't Daryl Hannah an SNL person? Anyway, angels and angelic national patrons. And so he says, he's commenting here on 29, 25 through 26, but he's going to hit 4:19 below. He says, Israel is warned not to worship and serve the other gods, gods whom Yahweh has not allotted to Israel. This implies that had he so desired, Yahweh could have allotted Israel to the other lesser deities, as he had the Gentile nations. In fact, earlier in 4:19 through 20, this is explicitly stated. Israel is not to worship the host of heaven, the sun, the moon, and stars, for these Yahweh, your God, has allotted to all the peoples everywhere under the heaven, but has kept Israel for his own possession among the nations, giving the common assumption in the ancient world of divinity of the heavenly bodies. It would appear that at least the author of Deuteronomy assumed that each of the nations had been assigned by Yahweh, the only true God, an angel or God to guide and protect it. These are symbols of deities. I mean, we get this in Job 38, where it parallels the morning stars with the sons of God. And of course, there, again, I mean, Henning even brought it up, the heavenly host language, the Lord of hosts. What is he the host of? Now, sometimes that exact phrase gets used, and seemingly sometimes it could just be referring to astronomical objects, but very often is referring to the heavenly host. to angels, to supernatural entities, unless you want to demythologize it completely and have Yahweh be the Lord of just gas giants and planets and stars and stuff like that. And it's like, that's not the case. Like when he calls them out by name, it's not, oh, look, there's that gas giant and that nebula over there. No, he's talking about supernatural entities. And there are really like 3 or 4 ways in the broader ancient world how this was understood. You either just had a simple representation, let's just say that, just purely symbolic. That object in the sky will associate with that deity. There was also the belief that it just simply was that deity. There were these massive bodies in the sky, and they moved. And so if they're moving, they're alive. That was the assumption. So the objects actually were the gods. Or you could have that the gods were, again, these astronomical objects are being governed or controlled by these entities, right? Again, the gods. Or they could even be living on planets or whatever, right? So they live on them. So again, there's any of those. I think probably the symbolic, just simple association is the simplest way to go. It doesn't carry too much baggage with it, and we still kind of retain it in some sense even today. Like all of our deity, there's a lot of deity names related to planet names, and that actually gets transposed over to the weeks, the days of the week and stuff like that. So you're going to have Sunday is Sunday. It's the day of the sun. Saturday is Saturn Day. It's the day of Saturn. And of course, Thursday is Thor's Day. I forget who Thor is identified with, Jupiter maybe. So there's just this symbolic representation. And so when it's talking about these as gods, it's just this symbolic association. I don't know what's so strange to them about this. In fact, let's look at all of these passages in parallel, and I think you'll kind of get why this is the way it is. Okay, so I've pulled up all the text, and I think I'm going to have to, I'll take myself off the screen so we can see the whole thing. And right now I have it set up to where anything, whenever I'm studying the Bible, I like to have the hover feature on. So just as I hover over a word, it's going to correspond a highlight to any other text I have open. So the underlying Hebrew is being highlighted. So this is 4:19. And beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. The Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance. And that's this Nahal language that we get over here in Deuteronomy 32. Now, this sun, moon, and stars language is explicitly word for word brought up in 17:3. So it's saying if somebody is apostatizing basically, and they've gone and served other gods, and here it's Elohim, and worshiped them, the sun, the moon, or any of the host of heaven, which I have forbidden. And so it has, again, this exact language, and it calls them Elohim. And they object to this. Heiser saying that they're gods. Heiser saying they're Elohim because the text says that they're Elohim. Again, it's symbolically associating them. And in fact, by the way, because you could kind of quabble with this, with what the ESV does here, I'm going to pull up the parallel translations here because the ESV is kind of unique in saying this, that they've gone and served other gods and worshiped them or the sun. So you might get this implication that it's saying you've worshiped other gods or the skies, like as if these are two different things. But basically every other translation, the NASB does the same thing, but even the King James, worship them either the sun, moon, and stars, like some English, and to the sun, moon, and stars, whether the sun or the moon, Septuagint, served other gods and worship them, the sun, the moon. So it's telling you what gods they're worshiping, the sun, moon, and the stars. The NLT, for instance, they might serve other gods or worship the sun, the moon, or any of the stars, which I have forbidden. So it's not this either or. They're symbolically linked here. So in 29:26, they went and served other gods. So this served and worshiped is being used in these passages. It's connecting these passages. And again, gods, Elohim, whom they had not known, whom he had not allotted to them. Again, it's the same language over here of the Lord's portion. The Lord has allotted to the other people. And even this, gods whom they had not known, it picks up pretty closely what we get in 32:17, which of course, they sacrificed to demons who were not God, to gods whom they had not known, new gods whom came lately, whom your fathers did not dread. So again, they're trying to divorce the context of 32:8, 4:19. It's a pretty common interpretation to say, hey, it's using similar vocabulary, so we interpret these off of each other. And if you bring in other parallel passages, 17:3, 29:26, the consistent picture we get is God allotted other Elohim to the other nations. Again, if you want to call them angels, go for it. Again, angels just means Malachim. Why is Malachim okay, but not Elohim, even when the text uses the word Elohim in all these passages? There really is no objection other than you don't like the conclusion, you don't like the tradition, or you just don't like Heiser. I don't know what it is, but this is just the simple phenomena of the text. Some of these clips are going to start speeding up here.
He says, more specifically, the dissertation demonstrated that Deuteronomy 4 and 32 evinces a monolatrous worldview, a conclusion shared by many scholars of Israelite religion. The God of Deuteronomy created the other gods, which are not idols, he says, lest Yahweh be a idol maker, and decreed they be worshipped by the non-elect Gentile nations. And I said to myself, so you're telling me that God created other gods, right?
By the way, he's going to object to all this. And again, we'll talk about the way you could parse some of this later. But the plain reading of what's in front of him, which the Lord your God, Yahweh your Elohim, has given these other Elohim to all the peoples under the whole heaven as a heritage. Of course, Israel is his heritage. And so what he's objecting to is kind of right there in the passage as he's objecting to the concept. It's like it's on the screen as you're disregarding it.
And then what, told other nations to worship them? Yep. Which is like, makes no sense whatsoever in my mind from a theological standpoint, where the God who says you should have no other gods before me, and
that's to Israel, by the way,
who tells us that there's only one, that there is only one God. And I'm like, where are you getting this? That he created? I mean, I don't see anywhere in
where are you getting this? It's on the screen right now.
Deuteronomy 32 or Deuteronomy 4, where he's creating these other gods. So
do the gods exist by themselves? Obviously, they would be created by Yahweh. It's not that difficult.
And decreed that they be worshipped by the non-elect Gentile nations. That just, I mean, I'm at a loss for words for what this is, what he's saying. Because I was like, huh?
Okay, now this is interesting to me because, okay, at least two things. First off, I want to make this point. They treat it like it's the weirdest thing in the world that God would decree this. God would decree this like idolatry. This is just crazy. Okay, say that to your Calvinist friends. Say that to your Augustinian brothers, because that's what they actually believe. They all believe that. Whether they would say that explicitly or not, the reality is if you take that Augustinian position and you believe that God decrees everything that comes to pass, that would include the pagan's idolatry. So don't treat it like this is the weirdest thing in the world if you're not going to say that about Calvinism, about Augustinianism, because they believe that. They'll try to put secondary, tertiary causes. It doesn't matter. Does it come from God's decree or not? If it's yes, then okay, then God decreed it. So that's not any different. Now, saying all that, there still is that question of, like, for instance, I think you could see this similar to when God punishes Israel for its apostasy or for its disobedience. What does he often do? He brings in another nation to punish them. Now, the thing is, that nation he brings in is still responsible for how they do it. So if they overstep their bounds, they will then turn around to be punished. Now, I think God knows what's going to happen. Yahweh is still sovereign over them and will punish disobedience. Similarly, I think God knows what's going to happen with the evolution of the pagan religions. Now, he's judicially punishing them by disinheriting them, by saying, okay, you want to do that. You want to go and serve other gods, because this goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. I would say they violated the first commandment. They had other Elohim before Yahweh. They listened to the serpent. The serpent is Satan. The serpent, Satan, is an Elohim, okay? So they listen to the voice of another Elohim. And again, the people do the same thing. They go after the sons of Elohim. They go after the sons of God in the intermarriage idea. And of course, the Tower of Babel, we know that there are other Elohim that eventually the nations get put under. And so it's like, okay, you want to be under the Elohim, you want to follow them, go for it. Now, God knows in which ways that's going to be destructive down the road, but he still does it anyways. And he's going to punish those powers for their disobedience. Psalm 82, Isaiah 24 and 34. the mini apocalypse of Isaiah, all of it really gets into this stuff. You can make an argument, and where I am personally on this issue is I think that largely the sons of God were supposed to shepherd humanity in a purely positive way. They were not supposed to take worship on themselves. Any of them that turned around to start doing that is it's a perversion. It was not the intent of God. Now, God knew it was going to happen, but God was not saying, and again, the same way he sent a nation to punish Israel, that's his intent. But his intent isn't for them to go overboard, which often they did. Now, again, God knows this stuff is going to happen, but he's still going to use it in some kind of way. And I think that that's what you got here. So now this is episode 2, and this is partially what was very difficult about editing some of these clips, is they had to come back and retract some things. And so whatever. So now we're going to actually pick up on some of the textual critical issues.
This needs to be understood. All right. The Dead Sea Scrolls, out of cave 4, there are 22 fragments or manuscripts of Deuteronomy. Altogether, out of all the caves of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have 33 manuscripts of Deuteronomy. Okay, if he can only, if this, my book says there's only one, if Heiser can only say 2 manuscripts point to the reading of sons of God, 31 out of 33 manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls that are reading children of Israel, and only 2 manuscripts that exist that have the sons of God reading. All right, from a textual critical level, would you take the overwhelming majority proportion of children of Israel?
Okay, so there is the clip.
So let's explain, in case people who didn't catch what the problem was with that comment, was that I said there's 33 manuscripts of Deuteronomy. 1 has the sons of God reading, and and I went on to say that the rest of them have sons of Israel reading. Well, the problem with the comment is that the Dead Sea Scrolls are very fragment, so the rest of them don't even have the particular verse in question. There's only 7 of the Dead Sea Scrolls that have Deuteronomy chapter 32, and there's only 2 that have verse 8. R is the one that has sons of Israel reading. It is the lengthiest one. It is the most accurate represented one that's consistent and well preserved as far as being consistent with the Masoretic manuscripts. The one he is representing is J with the sons of God reading, and it has a lot of alterations, a lot of problems with it. And then the other one is Q, which that one is just obviously very corrupt, very short as well. The one he's representing with the sons of God reading is also let me think here, R, which has sons of Israel, is actually the oldest one of these 3, and the J one that he's representing with the sons of God reading is actually the most recent. It was it's dated around 50 AD, while the other one is dated around 100 BC to 25 BC.
I want to play another clip first before I respond, and then we'll actually come back to this Mosaic authorship clip. Okay, so I had to find the right clip because it's kind of going to continue on this vein. This is part of the difficulty in responding to multiple videos at once, is they kind of go back in and out through different episodes of different, the same topics. So it's like, it was kind of a nightmare to edit. But here is going to get back into the textual critical issues.
A lot of your English translations won't read that he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. They'll say according to the number of the sons of Israel. Now, you don't have to be a textual critic, to address this. But if you had the ESV, a study Bible, there's a footnote according to the number of the sons of God. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls say. It's also what the Septuagint says. Septuagint has angels of God. They're supernatural beings. There are other translations, a handful of them, that actually have incorporated the Dead Sea Scroll material in the translation, because this is our oldest and best.
So now I wanted to address that, because I think you understand and you realize that oldest is not necessarily best. It depends on the quality of what's old, right?
And again, I'm going to call him out on a mistake. I'll say he made a mistake here. There's a factual error that he did not say. He says this Dead Sea Scroll manuscript is the oldest and best. No, he's talking about 4Q Deuteronomy J. 4Q Deuteronomy R has the sons of Israel reading, and it is older and better than the one he's representing.
Okay, and now you have a source that says it's older?
DSS, Dead Sea Scroll English Bible. All right.
Okay.
Actually, you could look at every individual manuscript, or you could look at each chapter and all the manuscripts and fragments that are represented on it. But if you go to the particular manuscript, he shows you the dates and composition, whether it aligns with the Septuagint, the Masoretic text, or if it's aligned with as a unique, it doesn't follow any text because it's that bad paraphrase.
Okay.
That's what's going on here.
In fact, I think Henning is the one that makes the mistake here. And I'll show you what I think happened. Now, I don't want to redo my whole setup here, so I'm going to be lazy and see if I can get this in here. So he's talking about 4Q Paleo Deuteronomy, and this is dated earlier because of the writing style, because of the script. That's why it gets dated earlier. Now, this website, Dead Sea Scroll library, whatever, it's actually pretty cool. I like it. But because of this, I think Henning, this is where he made his mistake. Now, let me go all the way down. Now, I'm not a textual critical person. Like, I do not care about these topics really at all. So I don't care for it. But So if somebody knows, if somebody is well versed in these areas, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but here's what I think happened. So let's look at this on the website. So they have verse 6 through 8. Now, as you can see, these little breaks here, this is where there's breaks in the manuscript. Now, we have verses 6 through 8. And what do we have down here? Children of Israel. And so he sees this and then goes all the way back and says, okay, so this came before. And so here we are. We're looking at 4Q Paleo R. And I'll spare you the woman version of this story where I give you all the gory details. We'll just kind of cut to the chase. But I was so baffled by this. I was like, why is nobody talking about this other manuscript that says Sons of Israel in it? And I could not figure it out. I was like, why is nobody talking about it? Because I was looking at all these sources. And then it finally occurred to me that Henning is the source of this claim. And I was like, and his source is that website. And then it all finally snapped into place. So here we're looking at the manuscript. In fact, we can literally look at the actual manuscript itself. So as you can see, these are kind of aligned because this is, again, Deuteronomy 32. But this little glove-shaped, Michigan-shaped piece is 35. Now, as you can see part of a word here, part of a word here, part of a word here, part of a word here. So this is all that survived of the manuscript. And here, this is divided, and this is the first line of verse 8. This would be when it says, divided mankind, is that part of the sentence. That's all that exists of verse 8 of this manuscript. Now, what happened, I think, is Henning went to the website and saw that it had the full text of verses 6 through 8. Again, all of that stuff in verses 6 through 8 is missing. We just get a couple of words in the middle of that. In fact, I wish the website had done what Logos does, because what they do is actually pretty cool with this. And someday I would like to do a resource. I like that website. I would like to do video on a bunch of free resources that are pretty cool that I think people should know about. But here, what Logos does, actually, now I'm blocking the text. So this is the Lexham Dead Sea Scrolls, Hebrew, English, Interlinear Bible. I think if I were to pull this up, I would have translations and stuff. Anyway, point is, we have the text. As you can see, what's white is there. And when I mouse over, it has the scroll, but of course you can't see it. But it's showing me where which scroll has that reading. So if I were to go to 32:8, so here's that divided. And as I can see here, 4Q, 45, Paleo, Deuteronomy R. So this is that one part that shows up. All this other stuff is missing in every other manuscript, basically. Here, this is bene Elohim. And it says 4Q, 37, Deuteronomy J. So again, like I said, what happened, it would seem, is he just saw it on the website, the whole text, and he thought the whole text was actually in that manuscript. This is why nobody's talking about this, is because it doesn't have either reading here. So that's basically what happened. Now, I'm not going to dunk on him too hard for this point. One, because I'm not 1,000% sure, but also because it's pretty understandable that this kind of thing happens. All right, so this is MacDonald's book, Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism is what he called this. And here he's getting into the stuff that we've looked at. In fact, we looked at that quote. But I want to read a footnote. I think it's 191. Nope, it's 190. So here he's talking about the reading of 4Q Deuteronomy J. And he says here in footnote 90, the fragment containing Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9 was originally associated with 4Q Deuteronomy Q. And this is Skihan. In fact, this is the guy that we were looking at earlier. Has been reclassified with Deuteronomy 4QJ. Let's just put the letter at the end. We'll just call it J. And again, this is back to Skihan. So he reclassified it. Now, I think basically think of it like puzzles. If you had a bunch of puzzles thrown on the ground, you would start trying to resort them. And because of that, because again, look at the manuscripts that we're seeing they're just tiny scraps. But as you start piecing them together, you can kind of start getting a picture. And that's what they were doing. Unfortunately, in the case of, in this particular case, they thought that J belonged to Q, part of that whole that part of that manuscript. And they were like, no, this is something different. And they put it over there. I don't think there's anything to J other than just verse 8 and 9. It's its own thing. Well, actually, no, I take that back. As far as Deuteronomy goes, that's it. Because J is actually a bunch of different quotes from a bunch of different texts. And they quote this part of Deuteronomy 32. But he, as McDonald continues, he says, because of this reclassification, he says, the impression is sometimes mistakenly given that this reading is preserved in two Dead Sea manuscripts. For example, Sanders, in his book, The Providence of Deuteronomy 32, which we've looked at, it's a really good book, and he lists some other people, including Mark Smith, which we'll talk about later. So because of the reclassification, sometimes people have done that. Now, Sanders explicitly does this for sure. I saw in his text, he does treat J and Q as if they're two different sources. Now, I don't know if I have Heiser's book here. I don't, an article that Heiser wrote. He seems to mention two, and Henning actually talks about this, which I edited out. But the weird thing is, Heiser actually, he quotes, scholars on this issue. And then he also quotes Emmanuel Tav in his book. And so now we're looking at Tav's book. And again, I'll try to remember to export these little sections and stuff like that so I can let you read some of this yourself. For our purposes here, he says the original reading L is reconstructed from 4QJ, bene Elohim, and 1QHA, 24, 33 through 34. And I was like, what is that? Well, it's this. As we can see right here, L to start the sentence in 34. And we'll look at the translation down here. And of course, it's very fragmentary. From the presence of, it's broken off, you are honored more than the sons of hell, the sons of God, who apparently here, blah, 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 the boundaries of the peoples. So that looks like it's quoting 32:8. The sons of God who hear, I don't know, the words of the Lord or something, and maybe were put over the boundaries of the people. Again, so you can see how it seems to be quoting Deuteronomy 32:8, or at least alluding to that concept, and there it has sons of God. And so, yeah, you kind of do have two, apparently, different manuscripts that talk about this. There's just a lot of stuff going on. In fact, as I was skimming through this Thanksgiving psalm, I saw some stuff that I was like, ooh, that's really interesting. So even though I don't care about this kind of stuff generally, I'm kind of glad I went down this rabbit hole because it led to some interesting things that I'm going to have to take a look at in more detail in the future. So now we get to the issue of Mosaic authorship. He takes a big issue with this stuff. Again, another unfortunately large section of the discussion.
Now, another thing someone did bring up, and I wanted you to comment on real quick, about you had said something about Heiser not believing that Moses wrote all or any of the Torah, right? You had kind of made that comment.
I mean, this is tied to Mosaic authorship.
I edited further into the discussion, so I cut out a lot of stuff, and now they're playing Heiser.
And those of you in this group, I think, predominantly know. I'm not one who believes that Moses wrote every word of the Torah. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it's demonstrable that it's not likely. But I'm also not a JEDPer. I'm not a proponent of the documentary hypothesis because I think it's based on circular reasoning. I'm what used to be called, back in the day, late 19th century, early 20th century, a supplementarian. That is, I think there's a substantial Mosaic core to the Pentateuch that had later information accrued to it. I think Genesis 1 through 11 went under a heavy editorial hand during the exile to specifically interact with ancient Near Eastern Babylonian material to create.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment quickly on this, and you may want to also. I don't get where he's getting that.
Prologue to the history of the patriarchs. I think that was intentional and deliberate and inspired, but it wasn't Mosaic at that point because Moses is long dead. So I'm what used to be called a supplementarian, which is out of fashion now. People are either JEDPers or they still want to hold to Moses wrote every word, including the stuff about his own death. I don't see where that's necessary at all. If you want my thoughts on this,
I don't know if you heard my burp.
You could Google drmsh.com and put in Mosaic authorship, and you'll find an old blog series about this. The third person references in the Torah to Moses. They're not just 4 or 5 of these. There are dozens, maybe even hundreds. So it reads very much like someone else is writing about Moses. You could say, well, we can refer to ourselves in the third person. Yeah, we can. If you do it a few thousand times, it starts to sound a little bit weird. If you do it occasionally, sure. But when it shows up, hundreds or even thousands of times, that's a little odd, to say that was done by the same person making reference to themselves in the third person throughout. And there's a lot of it. Okay, there's a lot of it. So you can just go look that up.
I wish he hadn't said thousand there, because that allows him, I know why he says that. He said it for a reason, but that allows Henning to Mote and Bailey fallacy this. But I think we're going to continue with them.
Talk about how he mentioned a first and third person reference in the Torah. All right.
Okay.
And when he's talking about this, he's generally distinguishing particularly Mosaic tradition, we'll put it that way, through Exodus and Deuteronomy. He usually leaves out Genesis on this
He leaves out Genesis because Moses was not alive at that time. So there's no possibility for him to be referring to himself when he didn't exist yet.
topic. All right. First and foremost, people who believe that Moses wrote all the words still accept the fact probably Joshua wrote about Moses' death. Okay. I believe Moses wrote every word of the Torah, but Joshua added that last chapter about his death. So that's a misrepresentation. That's a straw man argument. The second thing he said was there's thousands of times when the third person shows up in the narrative of, he's referring specifically to Exodus to Deuteronomy. There's a problem with that comment, first and foremost, technically, because what we need to do is assess those occasions when the third person, by the way, third person is like he or Moses referring to himself as Moses. You're referring to yourself in the third person instead of first person, I, me. We need to segregate verses that are referring to the author when he refers to himself in the third person compared to just the third person being used. And he didn't.
Okay. He does do that in the article, and he knows about the article. So he just kind of strawmans the article.
Specify that when he's saying thousands of times in the Torah where the third person shows up. So that is an inaccurate statement. Nevertheless, there is multiple times when Moses refers to himself in the third person. This is not a problem, and we know that. Anyways, think about the Gospel of John.
Heiser already talked about this. He said it's not, if it happens a couple of times, no big deal. People do this. But he's saying if it starts happening dozens of times, even into the hundreds of times, that's where it gets weird. Now, then he says the thousand. Again, I know why he says the thousand. We'll talk about it. But it does happen into the triple digits. So he's giving examples that's like, well, one time this happens. And it's like, okay, that's different, though, than it happening over 100 times. And he actually mentions John. I have no problem with John being the author, but he brings this up and it's like, yeah, but it's there's no actual author given to it, like intentionally so. So I wouldn't bring up an anonymous authorship book to prove this point. It's like that doesn't really work. Again, even though I think John actually wrote John, book that's attributed to John. Again, it doesn't say in the book that it's by John. So to try, like, there's an argument to be made that, like in the New Testament, that it's almost like witness protection kind of stuff. I mean, Christianity was illegal for the first couple hundred years. So you get a lot of this, like in the Gospels. Well, it'll say a certain man or something like that. And it's like, it doesn't give you all the details because, again, it's kind of like witness protection kind of thing. We can't dox these people. So it's kind of like being kind of vague about who the people are. So people would know, people in the community would know, but not outsiders or whatever. So anyway, we'll continue.
John never refers to himself in the first person, right? Most commentaries would look at 2 Corinthians 12.
We'll just let it go.
When Paul's talking about he had a vision in heaven and heard things that were unlawful to speak of, most people would say he's talking about himself, though he's using a rhetorical form of a third person.
Right.
This is how literary functions. So
he does it once.
It's really an irrelevant argument, but that's what he structured his entire basis on. Yeah. And what's specific is when the third person is being used to identify the author specifically, not just all third persons all the time. Sometimes they could be talking about Aaron. He did this. He's counting those when he says is used thousands of times. That has nothing to do with the authorship. So you have to segregate the authorship third persons and randomly, God said,
third persons.
He said,
Exactly. That's a good point. Yeah.
I have here the article, the web article that Heiser wrote. This is on his blog back in 2012. I think it's later in a clip that Henning will actually mention something that tells me he read this particular one that I'm looking at. So he knows this stuff. He's only giving you a piece of the information, I think, to push a certain narrative. So again, I'm scrubbing through. I'll show you screenshots or whatever. So, and I'll put a link to this article as well if you want to take a look at it. But Heiser's saying the most basic search they can do is third-person search, and it's going to yield over 6,000 instances. Now, again, as Henning keeps bringing out, well, that's not distinguishing between other people using the third person and specifically Moses, blah, blah, blah. Of course, Heiser actually takes out Genesis, and so it's down to 4,000. But he continues. He keeps narrowing the search down. He says, when we search for first-person verbs, the following results are dramatically less. So 994, he takes out Genesis, blah, blah, blah. This is where he gets a 7-1 ratio again. that Henning will eventually allude to in one of these clips. But continuing on, he says we can be a little more focused than this, though. He says, here's a search that asks for the number of instances where a third person verb has Moses himself as a subject. That is, instances where the author writes, and Moses did XYZ. Okay, so if Moses is writing this, why is he saying Moses did this rather than I did this? How many of those are there? There's 282 of these. Okay, this isn't Paul doing this one time. This is Moses doing this over nearly 300 times. Another search we can do. So he says these instances would have the writer saying something was done or said to Moses, as opposed to saying to me. So somebody did something to Moses, and the Lord said to Moses. If I was recording this, I would say the Lord said to me, so on and so forth. But he doesn't. He says to Moses. Something happens to Moses. How many times does this happen? 187 times, nearly 200. Again, where the writer is saying something was done or said to Moses. Again, as opposed to something being done or said to me, what you would suspect if Moses is writing about himself. I wish he hadn't said 1,000 times or whatever, because again, like I said, that allows Henning to kind of strawman the argument, where it's like, no, it's a pretty compelling argument. Like the first time I saw all this, I was like, that's really shocking. So this, again, would give the implication that there's a lot of editing going on at some point later. Now, Henning, I suppose, if he wants to, he could go in the direction of saying, well, Josh was the guy that did all of these, said to Moses and all this kind of thing. Maybe. But again, of course, you are also going to have things like updated place names and all this other stuff. So clearly people are touching it. There's really no debate that it's been touched up later. So I find that kind of interesting. But anyway, that's the first part of this Mosaic authorship issue, is he kind of like hand waves this, but it's like, yeah, this is a pretty important issue. But we will continue on. And this is funny because he says this a lot where he's like, I'm not going to make sweeping generalizations. And then he does it.
In my book, I mentioned a number of these things, and these are what he argues for, and one of the reasons why he rejects a Mosaic author. And again, I'll be careful to not make a sweeping generalization.
Right.
Maybe he accepts some of the Torah being written by Moses, maybe portions.
I'm what used to be called a supplementarian. That is, I think there's a substantial Mosaic core to the Pentateuch that had later information accrued to it.
Also, I'll mention he called himself a supplementarian. If he's accepting that position as supplementarian consistently, that view held that the composition of the Torah was between 700 BC to 500 BC. In other words, you're talking about a good 700 years after Moses' death. If that was when the Torah was composed, he's either
redacted, not like completely composed out of nothing.
He can't believe that Moses actually had his hand in writing. I don't know exactly what he means. And again, he's ambiguous. If he is a supplementary view, he cannot believe Moses actually wrote it, but Moses' teachings were embedded in what other people wrote. That's what he would essentially believe.
That is, I think there's a substantial Mosaic core to the Pentateuch that had later information accrued to it.
And so that's a problem. There's some doublespeak, like I mentioned earlier. If he's a supplementarian, then he shouldn't actually hold that Moses wrote any of it. But if he holds that Moses did write some of it, he shouldn't actually be a supplementarian.
That clip is just baffling to me, because to be supplementarian, by definition, means a belief in a Mosaic core. However much that was, it was supplemented by later material. Again, however much that is, who knows? But the point is, there needs to be something before it to supplement it. Like, I don't know how Henning can twist the supplementarian view to say there's no Mosaic authorship. That's baffling to me, because by its very definition, you have to have something to supplement. And so whether you believe it was redacted, like most supplementarians or whatever, let's just say that he actually went and counted noses and said, generally speaking, a supplementarian believes it was redacted in the 7th century, somewhere around there. It's redacted. It's not completely composed. He has this thing where it has to be all or nothing. He's going to do it here with this particular section.
He says it is also worth recalling that if Smith is correct about Yahweh and El were merged by the 8th century BC due to transferal of Asherah and Yahweh, or to Yahweh as consort, then a Yahweh El fusion had occurred before Deuteronomy was composed. What's he saying? He's saying Deuteronomy was composed after what? The 8th century BC. Based on that quote, he rejects the entirety of Deuteronomy being any word of Moses. So
No. And this is the problem with quote mining somebody. And I think that that's what Henning does. The more I've thought about this, I think Henning is just quote mining Heiser and not actually reading the full context. Now, I think he's probably eventually read everything from Heiser, but he's done so in piecemeal way to respond to stuff. So he hasn't actually heard the context of what's going on. Because I really genuinely wonder if off the cuff, he could read that quote and I could ask him, okay, what was the purpose of what Heiser's talking about? What is his point in quoting Mark Smith there or alluding to Mark Smith? Could he tell me? And I kind of doubt that he would know why Heiser is saying what he's saying. So let's actually look at this in a little bit more context. So this is in that series of back and forths he had in the Mormon Journal. And so in context, what he's talking about is the supposed separation of Yahweh and El. So you have Canaanite El over here, and Yahweh is just a tribal deity. The son of El is a lesser tier thing. They're separate deities. Okay. This is the argument. People like Mark Smith are going to argue this is what used to be old Israelite religion. And so this is what Heiser is talking about. Now we'll skip past the first part. Specifically, he's really talking about Deuteronomy 32 here in this particular context. Now he then moves off and to get to the second point. He says Ugaritic scholars have noted that the title Most High is never used of El in the Ugaritic corpus. Now, you get that in Psalm 82, it uses the term Most High. And of course, remember, they're in the Council of El. And so people will say, that's a separate deity. Yahweh is just one of the sons of this deity. Well, Heiser is saying, of course, in Deuteronomy 32, they're divided among the sons of God, and the Most High divides the nations, right? So they're assuming that's Canaanite El over there again, and Yahweh's just over here, junior member of the council. So that's the presupposition going into this. And Heiser's saying, wait, hold on. El is never actually called the Most High in the Ugaritic corpus. It's actually Bel. And Yahweh receives a lot of Bel titles throughout the rest of Scripture. So why would you not assume then that the Most High in Deuteronomy 32 is a reference to Yahweh? Because that would make more sense. It's consistent with what we get elsewhere, with the polemic of saying Bel isn't the rider on the clouds. Bel is not the Most High. It's Yahweh. So if we take that understanding to Deuteronomy 32, we would just assume, well, of course, it's talking about, it's a title of Yahweh. That's all it is. And then he continues in this line of thinking, in this line of argument. Heiser then says, this is about to pick up the quote that Henning read. Due to the well-established attribution of Bel epithets to Yahweh, the title Elyon could conceivably point directly to Yahweh in Deuteronomy 32:8. It is also worth recalling that if Smith is correct that Yahweh and El were merged by the 8th century BC due to the transferal of Asherah to Yahweh as consort, then a Yahweh-El fusion had occurred before Deuteronomy was composed. Now, perhaps he should have said here, to be fair, maybe he should have just said redacted, and that would have clarified matters more for Henning. In fact, in the same article, let's go all the way to the top and search Mosaic, maybe? Yeah. Of course, an original Mosaic text in Deuteronomy 15. Thought he didn't believe any of this was written by Moses. No, of course he does. But the point that he's making down there, I wish I hadn't done that because now I got to find that quote again from Mark Smith. So what he's getting at here, if you don't have the context for all of this, it doesn't really matter, because what people like Mark Smith are going to argue, and it's kind of strange because they argue both the subordination of Yahweh. Yahweh was just this junior member of the council. And then they'll also turn around and be like, ooh, we have this inscription, Kuntele Ajud, right? Stuff like that, where you have supposedly Yahweh having a wife and it's Asherah. Now, there's problems with that. It probably shouldn't be Asherah as in the goddess, a wife, but scholars like Smith go in that direction. Well, they'll say, no, this is at least somewhere, some Israelites believe that Yahweh had a wife and it was Asherah. Of course, in Canaan, who's Asherah's husband? Well, it's El. So then the supposition is that Yahweh was fused with El by this point. So Heiser's saying, if Smith is correct here in this fusion, Heiser doesn't believe this. If he was right, though, this is where I'm getting back to where I was saying, I don't think Henning even knows anything about what's going on in this discussion, or he's not He's just taking a snippet of the conversation out. And what really frustrates me is this is Heiser, I feel like, at his best in taking on the enemy on their turf with their presuppositions and saying, even with your he's doing what Justin Martyr did, right? Let's go with your argument and we'll still destroy it here. Similarly, he's saying, look, even if Smith is correct that Yahweh was believed to have had a wife in the 8th century, and you believe that Deuteronomy was composed later, 200 years later, how does that make any sense? That Yahweh is a junior member of the council under El, if he's already been fused with El 200 years earlier. This is his point. He goes on to make exactly this point. Why bring back to mind this separation that had been rejected 200 years ago? It doesn't make any sense. And this is what Heiser's point in all of this is, but he just reads you this thing for one purpose, to tell you that Heiser thinks that Deuteronomy was composed in the 6th. It's like, and he doesn't believe in Mosaic authorship. That's his entire point of this, reading that quote. And it's like, Heiser's making a great point here against the liberal scholarship. But of course, Henning tells us that Heiser's more liberal than the liberals. And they'll continue on the Mosaic authorship thing.
So this is on page 299, which might be different on a digital version. And it says, quote, the dimensions of Og's bed are not the dimensions of the actual height. So he's actually saying it's historically inaccurate. While
Right.
the text
No. This is here exhibit A of Heiser derangement syndrome, because Heiser says, gives you dimensions. It's not dimensions of Og's height. It's dimensions of his bed. And Henning takes that to say that Heiser's saying it's actually historically inaccurate.
Og's bed are not the dimensions of the actual height. So he's actually saying it's historically inaccurate. While
Right.
the text
I
is
saw that.
clear, while the text is clear that he was the last of the Rephaim, and that Rephaim was a term associated with the giant Anakim, Deuteronomy 2:11, who were from the Nephilim, Numbers 13, 20, 32 through 33. The bed's dimension is mythotheological. That is, the dimensions are designed to take readers back to Mesopotamian religion, the original context for Genesis. All right. So when he's saying these dimensions are taking you back to Mesopotamian origin of Genesis, he's implying that the Jews were in Babylon when they composed Genesis to have the interaction with the Mesopotamian backdrop. So if you've read Reversing the Herman, he talks about the
Redacted, not written, not composed, like completely out of nothing.
Genesis to have the interaction with the Mesopotamian backdrop. So if you've read Reversing the Herman, he talks about the Apkallu mythology being the backdrop of the Nephilim. And I have a whole chapter, well, not a whole chapter, half of my chapter on who are the sons of God is dealing with debunking this Apkallu problem. So I'll avoid the sweeping generalization saying that he taught Moses didn't write any of the Torah, but it's very questionable if he actually believed that Moses did write any of it.
So there he was reading from Reversing Herman, or also known as Reversing the Herman. He quotes half of a footnote, and it's from Unseen Realm. So we'll actually just read that, and starting at page 198. And so Heiser wrote in that, first, the most immediate link back to the Babylonian polemic is Og's bed. Its dimensions, 9x4 cubits, are precisely those of the cultic bed in the ziggurat called Edemonanki, which is the ziggurat most archaeologists identify as the Tower of Babel referred to in the Bible. So now let me break in for a second. So chapter 11 is, of course, the Tower of Babel. Now, it should be noted that Babel, the word there, is the same word for Babylon. It's literally the Tower of Babylon. It should be whatever you're going to do in either direction. I think it's better to just go with Babylon all the way through, but it's exactly the same term. So, yeah, I mean, it's like punching you in the face that they're polemicizing Babylon with the Tower of Babel. So anyway, continuing back, ziggurats functioned as temples and divine abodes. The unusually large bed at Edemonanki was housed in the house of the bed. It was the place where the god Marduk and his divine wife met annually for ritual lovemaking, the purpose of which was divine blessing upon the land. Scholars have been struck by the precise correlation. It's hard not to conclude that, as with Genesis 6:1-4, so with Deuteronomy 3, those who put the finishing touches on the Old Testament during the exile in Babylon were connecting Marduk and Og in some way. So not composing out of nothing. It's those who are putting the finishing touches. So maybe they didn't mention the size of Og's bed. And here they put dimensions specifically. And maybe, who knows? Like, I wouldn't even care if the dimensions were 9 by 3 cubits. And they said, no, put 4 because that will match it directly with this thing over here. I wouldn't even care because ancient authors did that kind of thing. So who cares? Anyway, continuing on. The most transparent path is, in fact, the giant stature. Og is said to have been the last of the Rephaim, a term connected to the giant Anakim and the other ancient giant clans in the Transjordan. Marduk, like other deities in antiquity, was portrayed as superhuman in size. However, the real matrix of ideas in the mind of the biblical author may be derived from wordplay based on Babylonian mythology. By the way, it should be noted that Marduk wasn't a big deal in Mesopotamia until the exilic period. And so it's stuff like this that scholars look at and say, hey, look, it looks like they're taking a shot at Marduk. And if they're specifically taking a shot at Marduk, that really would only be relevant during that exilic period. Now, again, Henning refuses to understand this, or he just doesn't understand. I don't know what's going on. I think he just refuses to accept or to kind of even entertain these thoughts. But what Heiser is saying is, look, and you could go in a direction literally of saying like what I just laid out. It could have the entire narrative of Og of Bashan without the dimensions. And the dimensions are later put in specifically to connect to the cultic site, the Marduk cultic site that would have only been relevant during that period in Mesopotamian religion. Same thing with like Genesis 6. The Nephilim thing, Heiser thinks it's specifically like a Aramaic term for giant. It doesn't have to mean the entire passage was created out of nothing before then. In fact, I don't think that that's the case at all. I don't think creating stories out of nothing brand new would kind of go over really well. So it's like I can completely see how you would put a finishing touch, a specific phrase, word, dimension here or there to connect thoughts back to these ideas over here. It seems like the most natural thing in the world. So you don't have to discard Mosaic authorship with this kind of updating. It's the way ancient literature was done. So anyway, we will continue on.
In Deuteronomy 32, that's one of his main passages, right? With those 3 options, I said, okay, which one is more likely written by the author of Deuteronomy? Okay. And what I did, I did a search because it's bene Yisrael is what it says, sons of Israel, but it's translated children. And I said, okay, if this guy, this author, is saying sons of God in
this author
in Deuteronomy 32:8, has he ever used that phrase before? Because again, that's a part of hermeneutics. And you even wrote something about that in your book. I did the research. Not one time, 0, has the author of Deuteronomy ever referenced sons of God, bene ha-Elohim or bene Elohim. He never uses that. But
sorry about that. Are you sure? Are you sure about that? The author of Deuteronomy never says sons of God? I thought it was Moses. He uses it in Genesis 6.
But you know how many times he uses children of Israel, bene Yisrael?
I would guess probably closer to 100.
No, just 19.
And if I can piggyback
Yeah, go ahead.
with
And again, they're getting back into sonship language. Nobody's denying that.
those comments in the link that dealing with the Deuteronomy 32 manuscripts, I comment back to the article that I posted right before that, which is an excerpt from my book dealing with sonship in the Bible, in the Old Testament, sonship and fatherhood language in the Old Testament.
So again, nobody's denying the sonship language. In fact, it's kind of interesting because this reminds me of only one thing is called these sons of God, and that's supernatural entities. But the concept of the children, again, I'm trying not to use the phrase because it's only reserved for one thing, but conceptually, God's children, Israel, the king, and supernatural creatures. I'm reminded of a debate or a discussion. I think it was a debate between Bart Ehrman and it might have been Craig Evans. And in like a discussion portion, Evans asked him, because this is when Bart was like really into his idea that the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Jesus is not portrayed as divine at all. He's just a prophet, blah, blah, blah. And so Evans was like, so, like, what are you willing to concede? What do you think they believed or they wrote about Jesus? What was the argument there? And Ehrman was like, I believe, they believed Jesus was a prophet. He was the Messiah. I think he gave him that. He did exorcisms. And then he said, Son of God. He was the Son of God. And I was like, wow, that's quite the concession, because, again, go back to the Old Testament. The Son of God is corporately Israel, the king. Jesus is a Davidic descendant. But more than those things, what is Jesus? Is God, his divine. And again, sons of God, the Son of God language, it's reserved also for divine. So I think that there is a conceptual linking these concepts that's important, not to completely sever. And in fact, I would say, like, for me, I can see the both and of the Israel king and then the supernatural category. They all get merged into Jesus. And then by extension, after Jesus, they then get applied to believers. That's why messianic ideas get applied to believers. We're put over the nations. We become partakers in the divine nature, stuff like that. I think it's important. I think the sonship language is important, but they're missing a whole dimension to it because they cut off the supernatural part of it. And so they miss that grand reversal that's happening. I said, you are sons of God. They were supposed to be, but nevertheless, they will die like men. Well, who's not going to die like a man? Believers, because we will inherit immortality. The gift of God is eternal life, these ideas. So anyway, we'll continue here. They're going to get into verse 43, and we can finally discuss this.
If you want to accept one of the corrupted Dead Sea Scrolls, verse 43 has sons instead of servant, which is also clearly referring to Israel. So even in Deuteronomy 32, the context demands sons of God. If you want to read that Dead Sea Scroll text into the text, you still have to interpret it as Israel, because that is the context and that's what it's demanding.
I think we already saw particularly that clip, but I wanted to hold off the discussion for now. Since this discussion overall has already gone so long, we'll speed run this. So this is in Nathan McDonald's book on monotheism in Deuteronomy. He says here, divine beings appear in the final call to praise in verse 43. And so that actually creates a nice inclusio, which the MT actually kind of severs. There are considerable textual difficulties in this verse. The LXX for QQ and the MT give three different textual traditions, each of which gives a significantly different reading of the verse. These traditions need to be reviewed prior to a consideration of the meaning or their meaning for the issue of the existence of other gods in the Song of Moses. The MT reads, and here he has the MT, here he has the Dead Sea Scroll, here he has the Greek, and he gives us a nice little chart here that shows us how this plays out. So the MT only has 4 verses. The Dead Sea Scroll here has 6 verses, and it's missing these center 2. And then the LXX has all of them. It seems to combine all of them. So he points that out here. So here's the thing. An application of some of the principles of textual criticism would suggest a shorter reading is preferable to a longer one. So generally speaking, that's the direction you would go, which would be the MT. Well, there's a problem with that. Although the MT has the shortest text, there are at least 2 problems with it. First, the MT cannot account for the presence of lines 2 and 4 in Deuteronomy and 4QQ and the LXX. Secondly, the first and last lines of the MT, corresponding to lines 3 and 8 in the Greek, have no parallel line. It is unlikely then that the MT represents the original text. And then he goes on to kind of get even further into the weeds. But here's the point, what is getting at that I think is important, because I think it's possible to misunderstand his point here, where he says that the MT lacks these parallel lines in 3 and 8. So here we see the MT has this line and has this line. Now, what he means is, like, for instance, 4Q doesn't have line 3, but it also doesn't have line 4. But it does have line 8 and it has line 7. So the point is this: Hebrew poetry rhymes in thought, not sound. And so imagine a word, you get a line, and then it has no rhyming line that goes along with it. And then it rhymes, and then again, it has a line that has no rhyme with it, whereas the rest of them are rhyming. This rhymes with this rhymes with this, and then these, of course, rhyme here, these rhyme here. So it's like all of a sudden you have a line that's missing the rhyme. What happened to it? And it's very suspect. And so people are like, there's something going on here. they clearly muddled with it. And so, of course, Henning keeps going on and saying that the Dead Sea Scroll is, deviant, it's corrupted and all this stuff. And it's like, there does seem to be a corruption, and it seems to be happening via the MT. Because again, it severs that connection, that nice connection that we have to the inclusio there at the bottom. Like he says here, the MT contains a single exhortation to the nations to praise Israel. This, however, appears to be a rather strange conclusion to a song whose main theme has been Israel's unfaithfulness, right? That's just really odd. And here at the bottom, the inhabitants of heaven and earth are exhorted to rejoice, forming a neat inclusio with the song's opening. So it calls on the heavens and the earth to witness. And here at the end, the divine assembly is called to praise Yahweh. And of course, I think it's also of note, although he does say it's not really clear whether it's the same divine beings all the way through, but I think it's possible that it is. So in verse 8, we get the sons of God, and they are the Shadim. They are the guardian spirits over these geographical regions. Of course, we know they become corrupted. Israel starts worshiping them. And there at the end, kind of like Psalm 29, the enemies of David, remember, David calls on even the rebellious, Genesis 6, sons of God to worship Yahweh. It's the same thing. It's calling on even those spirits are to worship Yahweh. But back to the video.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the bigger problems, ignoring immediate context for some novel idea and importing pagan mythology into the text.
I mean, we saw it. It's not novel. We saw all the early church really goes in this direction. They understood this stuff.
If we track through Deuteronomy, this passage, Deuteronomy 32:8, has parallels in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20, Yahweh takes Israel as his own, and he forbids the worship of the sun, moon, and stars, who are called Elohim, gods, in Deuteronomy 17. And in Deuteronomy 29, 23 through 27.
Yeah, so what's interesting is he realizes that, those are sun, moon, and stars, but then all of a sudden they're actual real gods. It's like, no, people worship the sun, moon, and stars as gods, not that they actually were gods.
Based on what? If you read Deuteronomy all the way through, you read it as one book, full context. Again, we get a consistent picture emerge that Yahweh has delegated the supernatural creatures, the lesser of them, over the other nations. It's consistent with everything else we read. Again, we already went through this, so it's not worth going over, but it's like, I don't get what their inability to see this symbolism, this connection between the two. And of course, the only way they can cope with this is to say, well, they worship them as gods, but it doesn't say that they're gods. The text says that they're Elohim.
Yeah, I would say that's some of his ambiguity and doublespeak right there. Their sun, moon, and stars are gods. That's what he just said.
That's what the text says.
And as he's saying all of this, it's almost like he doesn't realize what he's saying. So it's like you're saying that God himself actually gave these people over to these beings that, if he's the God of the Bible, he knows what's going to happen. He's omniscient. So he knows.
Again, we already kind of dealt with this earlier, but again, if you're a Calvinist, if you're an Augustinian, I think both of these guys, you actually believe this already. So if you're going to criticize Heiser, you have to criticize every Augustinian, because everything that comes to pass, including pagan worship, is decreed by God.
They're going to be corrupt, but he gives them to them anyway.
I would argue that Michael Heiser had open theism, so he does his view of God, and this would be another point of doublespeak, because somehow God encrypted prophecy that had to be fulfilled in the Bible, but at the same time it had to be encrypted.
Said this in part 1 that I made this call earlier where they didn't go into the open theism thing, but I was like, I think a big problem of this that they have with this kind of thing is they don't like any autonomy of any creature, because somehow God's not big enough to handle that.
Because if the bad sons of gods figured out what God's plan was, then they could overcome that. He never said, yes, this is my position. But if you assess his theology as a whole system, it seems like he held open theism, saying that God didn't actually know the future.
So this is a recording from ETS. This whole lecture is actually on my page. You could search this title here and you will find it, Decision Making in Yahweh's Heavenly Council. And I don't put that it's from ETS for obvious reasons. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if it'll get flagged, but that's what the recording is from. One thing I wanted to know, he's talking about particularly the Kaila incident, right? That's what he's talking about here as he begins this particular portion.
The passage has received surprisingly little attention when it's discussed, the focus is typically that a future event that doesn't happen is certain given certain conditions. I wouldn't disagree, but I think that misses something more obvious. The passage clearly has God foreknowing an event that never happens. That means that foreknowledge does not necessitate predestination. In other words, the fact that God foreknows something doesn't require that the thing foreknown be predestinated. This connection is at the heart of any view that wants all events to be predestinated, but this passage severs that connection.
There he's talking about basically Calvinism.
In other words, it creates the possibility that while God can foreknow all events real and possible, he doesn't need to predestinate either. And in the context of what we've seen about the way God runs his affairs, at times ordaining an end but not a means, this distinction seems coherent. So in summary, with respect to actual events, God may or may not have predestinated them, but he foreknows them all, and even foreknows events that don't happen. It is at this point I'm in disagreement with open theists who insist that God doesn't know, I should say some open theists, who insist that God doesn't know human choices ahead of time. That seems incoherent in that if God foreknows events that don't happen, the whole range, any event he can foreknow that doesn't happen, why wouldn't he foreknow what the possible choices were and which choice would be made? And I don't see how that conclusion is driven. How can God foreknow a list of options that will not happen but be unable to know the thing that does? Doesn't make sense to me.
Why would sons of Israel make any sense? Well, it doesn't, because Israel didn't exist yet. It creates a conundrum with the flow of biblical history. God's not going to be dividing the nations up according to a nation that doesn't exist yet.
So now I wanted to address that claim of his, because that is where I think he messed up. Now, the sons of Israel, first of all, did exist at the time of the writing of that song, because I did some research on this. Because again, this is not something I had my own made up theology before I came to Heiser, and now I'm using my own personal views to fight Heiser. No, this is my own research now. This past week, okay, I researched this and I said, let me look at this a little more closely.
So he became an expert in this in a week.
Is it possible, okay, for God to have called the children of Israel before they actually were in existence?
I realized I never actually went over 32:8 in a particular point that I wanted to make about it. So once again, they're kind of going into this predestination aspect as it pertains to Deuteronomy 32, saying that God looked through the corridors of time, said, there's 70 souls going into Egypt. I'm going to divide them that way. And I said, you could take the both and view that we saw in that dissertation, but I didn't like that explanation. And here's why I don't like it. So when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. Now, here's the issue. Let's go ahead and pull this out over here. This is from Sanders' book, The Provenance of Deuteronomy 32. Now, here's ultimately the point he's making, is we have this inheritance and heritage. It's the same underlying term. It's in the hall. Here's the question. What is the inheritance, so to speak? So the word here, and this is nations, is the object of the verb. Blah, 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 blah. Many scholars interpret the nations as an accusativus personae, implying the peoples of the earth are inherited property, that is their lands. Others interpret the word as accusativus rei. These sound like Harry Potter spells or something, like your furniture's going to start levitating, which implies that the peoples were given as an inheritance, that is to the heavenly beings. Okay, so we have the nations here, the object. But what's happening? Are the nations being given lands, geographical locations? You get Egypt, you get whatever. Or are the nations being given to the sons? We'll just say the sons to be neutral. Are they being given to the sons as part of that inheritance? No, you, person over here, you get Egypt, you get Mesopotamia, whatever. So which one is it? And scholars are basically divided on which one it should be. But he says, since in verse 9, Jacob is presented as the Nahal, the heritage of Yahweh, the interpretation of the nations as accusativus rei is most probable. The concept of deities having personal property is also attested outside of Israel. Of course, he went over all those quotes of people taking it exactly this way, the early church as well as pagan literature. So the point I have is this. I don't think the foreknowledge view works because it's not as if, and I've seen this kind of argument where it's like God is dividing up either by number, 70 people, and then you have 70 nations at Babel. By the way, we never actually have a number in this passage, but people go in that direction. But other people will say, no, actually is talking about more so is it's more about the land and saying he divided the nations, understanding the promised land would belong to Israel. So this is a place I've carved out for them. So I'm going to move people around them. Like, they get their own borders or whatever, but here's where the promised land is going to be, that kind of idea, roughly speaking. And of course, I don't think that works at all, because what happens when the Israelites get to the promised land? There are people there. They have to fight for the land, right? It didn't happen this way at all. So I don't think that works. Now, back to the foreknowledge view. Again, I don't think it works either, because what's happening is the nations are being given to the sons. Israel, and this gets back to Heiser's point, more broadly speaking, Israel never is put over the nations. They never inherit the nations. They're separate from the nations. Who is put over the nations? Well, certain princes, certain principalities and powers, right? So to honor the parallelism, I don't know how we can have the sons of Israel at all in this reading. And so for this reason, I do kind of have to agree that I think the sons of Israel reading, for whatever reason, ended up being put in as it's one word. You change one word and you change the whole meaning. But I think it was done to basically scrub this idea. It was to sanitize this idea because they were uncomfortable with it. But hey, the whole point of textual criticism is to get to what the original text is. Again, people like Henning will be like, oh, they're changing the text, the later the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, Dead Sea Scrolls are earlier. But the point is, it's the concept of changing the text. And it's like, well, who's making the change? We need to know that. You can't just assume, I like this particular text, and then anything is a deviant from that text. Well, how do you know? You have to determine that is the original text. But anyway, I don't think that this really works, this foresight kind of view. Maybe somebody can convince me why I should take that both and approach, but I'm just not convinced by it. But back to the video.
Where Heiser is erring here, one, it would, again, confirm the point that I'm saying he's open theism. If he's denying that this could be God has foreknowledge,
right?
That's his logic right here in his argument, right? So that would imply, again, it would be another piece of evidence to this puzzle of, is he open theism? It seems like he is, because he seems to not represent the God he calls Yahweh to have foreknowledge. But secondly, and your argument is completely accurate, but I would also add the simple fact.
Okay.
Who wrote Deuteronomy? Did they write it during the time of Babel or after? Because,
after, obviously. Yeah.
Right. So they're writing in retrospect after the event. They're saying that's the division of the nations was the same number that Israel went when they went down into Egypt. It doesn't even need to be interpreted as a prophetic utterance of Israel's number before they even arose. It could just be the author knows this stuff because that's the history, and he's writing in retrospect of these numbers and how they factor in. So even him, who has a later date on Deuteronomy, they're still writing in retrospect. Either he is here, and well, he actually is denying foreknowledge for God, but he's also not even being consistently logical with the fact that an author can represent history.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I want to say I saw Heiser actually mentioned in the footnote. I know he's aware of this. I mean, he cites Sanders a lot in his dissertation, but I saw Heiser mention this. I think he would go to that idea of saying that Israel wasn't in existence yet, because it's just kind of a simpler way to get to the point. I wish he had focused more on that, the grammatical aspect of it, because I think if you go in that direction and you're like, you honor the parallelism, I don't see any reason why, like, all of those arguments then fail. So, for instance, he's saying it doesn't even have to be a foreknowledge thing. It could be a retrospective of Moses looking back at the Tower of Babel. But again, why would they be divided according? Why would the nations be given to the sons of Israel? It never happens. So you end up having, again, a historical event that never happens. So that's a problem. Now they're going to get into the head covering thing. Another one of these things where it's like I don't even care to get into it, but man, they actually go over this in like multiple episodes. They spend a lot of time. I think it's the host really doesn't like this because Henning seems to not be as interested in this topic.
There's one great thing about the test of infertility that's just great. How it involves having a woman smell something and the hair is involved. It's just the craziest stuff you've ever read.
And I think what he's talking about is Numbers 5, which is a test of infidelity, not fertility. I don't know if you've read that passage.
Yeah.
5.
he's talking about the test of infertility. He's not talking about Numbers 5. The Greeks had this test of infertility, and he's talking about that whole thing. So no, he's not talking about the Bible here.
Oh yeah,
31.
Yeah, with the bitter water for the woman's test.
Yeah, I think that's what he's referring to, but he called it test of infertility, which is not correct. And the thing is here, the Bible doesn't say a woman's hair helps her have children. That is a speculative. I mean, as I was reading what they actually believed about how reproduction worked, I'm like, this is ridiculous. And you actually want to have God co-signing such ignorance of science and biology?
Yeah.
Paul co-sign that?
So a lot of this is going to come to our level of how conservative or liberal we are, all right? And where we...
I wouldn't say conservative or liberal, but it does go to our understanding of inerrancy and inspiration, for sure.
Stand on the Bible's inerrancy.
All right, let's go full screen for this, although this is too big and I make myself smaller. So my problem is, again, this is an inerrancy issue. And in fact, the first time I heard about this thing, the Hedvel issue, was when Heiser posted these articles. And it was a series he did on inerrancy. You can still find it on his blog. And he posted a couple of other articles. But when I read the article, I instantly knew exactly where he was going, why he put it, why he gave us that article to read. And it was like, I mean, it instantly all made sense to me. Not so much, not the passage per se, although I do think it has explanatory power. But I understood what he was getting at, why he would put that there. Because, okay, let's look at the Hedvel thing. Again, the host is like really offended. Like, you can't have this level of lack of scientific understanding in the Bible. You can't have God co-signing it. You can't have Paul co-signing and all that stuff. Okay, you want to go in that direction. Let's think about this for a second. Paul was already being kind of questioned for his credentials. He didn't have the right PhDs. He didn't go to the right schools. But he's saying, hey, look, I know what I'm talking about when it comes to these theological matters, when it comes to the Lord. I'm educated in this stuff. And so they were already questioning him in certain ways. They were kind of skeptical of him. Some people, obviously, there were people trying to push back against him. Now, let's look at this issue. So the people in Corinth are having this issue of the women taking off their head veils to prophesy in church. And in the broader ancient world, really almost everywhere in the ancient world, it would have been immodest for a woman, for like a married woman, to just take off her head veil in public or show her hair to like another man who's not her husband or something like that. And what's funny is, if the argument had only gone in that direction, if Troy Martin's argument was basically that, was the hair is to unveil your hair would have been immodest and amounted to basically nudity in a sense, I don't think anybody would have objected to it. It's the fact that he puts that provocative head testicle thing in the article, in the title of the article. It throws people off. They're like, wait, what? What are you talking about? And then he goes through the medical literature and shows the ancients actually believed that the hair on a woman's head specifically, but in general, hair, it had something to do with conception, the ability to conceive. And I'm not going to get into all of that stuff. Again, I kind of presume you probably already know about this issue, but that's the short version. The Cliff Notes version is that hair they considered functioning kind of like a private part. And so what Paul is saying is God gave women her hair as a private part. So judge for yourselves, should a woman be unveiling her hair in public or in church and worship? And obviously the answer is no. Now, going all the way back, is this then an error in the Bible? Is this a mistake in the Bible? I would say no. Now, some people, I think like the host here is deeply bothered by it. But I'm like, why would that be an issue? And for me, it's just so intuitive. I genuinely have never had this problem. I look at this and I'm like, I can compartmentalize here. It's not a mistake. Why is it not a mistake? Now, obviously, it's not scientifically true, but is this a mistake in the Bible? I would say no, because Paul is not teaching biology. That's not his point. His point is modesty and decency in the church. That's his primary issue. That's the issue he's addressing. That's the issue they're having. Now, to kind of combat with what the host is saying, okay, let's go with his view of inspiration here. Paul is about to say something scientifically inaccurate and scientifically ignorant. So right as he's about to write this book, God taps him on the shoulder and says, hey, it has nothing to do with conception. Let me teach you about human biology. He matrix downloads into his brain 21st century and beyond science, DNA, all this stuff. Okay, what does Paul do? Is he like, oh, okay, first off, he has a problem with that. He doesn't have words for any of this stuff. But what does he do? Does he put that in the letter? Does he write to the people, hey, I know you guys know about, and you guys have like a long history of like Hippocrates who wrote about this stuff, Aristotle who wrote about this stuff. Again, specifically the head veil kind of stuff, or not the head veil, but the hair being part of a woman's genitalia, basically. I know you guys have this history, and you're very proud of it. But those guys were kind of morons. They don't understand what's going on. And let me teach you. I don't have the words to describe this, but let me teach you where babies really come from, all of this stuff. DNA, let me teach you this. That's great. Guess what? The problems still persist in the church. You haven't dealt with the issue that to them, it would have basically been nudity. Now, okay, maybe you convince everybody in the church. But what happens when somebody outside of the church comes into the church? They walk in and see nudity. They see all the women, exposing themselves. They're going to think something very different. Oh, I know what kind of cult this is. I've been to one of these fertility cults, and they take off their shirt and jump right in, right? You give the wrong impression. What happens when the women leave the church? Do they put on the veil in public? Because they would have, they would look like prostitutes basically. And so, oh no, so they condescend to the culture when they go outside. Why couldn't God just condescend to the culture to begin with and not bother to stop Paul from writing this part and say, hey, look, Paul's giving moral instruction that still applies today about not ruining your witness before other people, modesty, decency in the church, non-nudity in the church, things like that. That still applies. Now, one thing that I do want to make a point on, a caveat, I've never actually seen anybody take this issue, but people will try to make parallel arguments to this. Again, nobody's ever done this, but let me actually take that argument and then let me apply it over here in a way that doesn't work. But I could see somebody trying to do this. They could argue, well, in the same way, the Bible was ignorant about the way Paul was ignorant about this issue, the biology here. The Bible is also, Paul was also, Jesus was also ignorant about human sexuality. He didn't know anything about gender. Gender's on this spectrum. It's this thing. And he didn't know about committed homosexual relationships. And that's why, we need to be more affirming in the church, blah, blah, blah. Okay. That's different. That is entirely a different argument, because here I'm saying Paul's science, like everybody else, was inaccurate on this particular point. But unlike Muhammad actually does this at times where it's like they question his prophethood and is like, let me teach you about what God has told me. And then he gives the most scientifically ignorant stuff you've ever heard. So he defends his prophethood by his scientific knowledge, and it's just trash, right? That's not what Paul's doing. Paul is saying, again, what everybody knows, the science of their day, and saying, we know a woman should not be exposing her hair in public because God has given her this as part of her private parts. So don't expose your private parts in church. That part still applies to this day, even if we don't consider hair part of the private. But to pivot to the other issue, like sexuality issues, that's entirely different, because there you have Paul give these vice lists. These people will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. And he lists things like among them, homosexuality, those who practice homosexuality. If Paul, if Jesus, if the Bible, if they're wrong about these matters, you have the Bible wrong about spiritual matters, about matters that get you to heaven, right? You have, Paul is saying these people will not inherit heaven. If Paul is wrong about that, we can't possibly know who gets into heaven and what keeps us separated from God. We can't possibly know what things God likes and doesn't like and things we shouldn't be doing. We can't know. And so that is an entirely different argument than what Heiser's saying here. Heiser's saying, look, it's not about science. It's about morality, decency in the church. That's what he's addressing. And he uses pre-scientific thinking beliefs that they had in their culture to get that point across. So that's the issue. I really don't see this, like, some people are just like, they just cannot go in this direction at all. And if it's for the inerrancy issue, I understand why they have that trepidation. But again, if you can put this in proper categories, it really doesn't become an issue, because even so, you have other issues. I mean, like the kidneys are the seat of the intellect and stuff like that in the Bible. I mean, like literally that's what it says. You get some of these phrases that talk about like the heart and the mind. In Hebrew, it's literally talking about things like your gut, literal stomach. Now, yes, we still use gut instinct, things like that. It's the language of phenomena. Either way, if you press this too far, the Bible can't say anything that could possibly be construed as scientifically inaccurate. Again, that's that cartoony Bart Ehrman view of Scripture that gets imploded the deeper you study. It's better to just keep proper categories about what the point of inspiration. The point of inspiration is revelation. It's communication. So God allows the people to communicate in language, custom, things that they understood. And it's not always going to be the same for all. Like I'm saying, the customs and idioms are not going to be the same for all times and stuff like that. But the moral instruction is always relevant. But anyway, now this is interesting to me because the Genesis Marks the Spot podcast, she did an episode on the book review, and there she talked about how Henning apparently takes the angel's view of Genesis 6, which is funny to me because here the host is actually just going to like crap on the idea. And so he's just sitting there. Apparently he takes the angel view. So it's kind of
My
funny.
view is angels. Genesis 6 is not about angels having cohabitating with women. Okay. Because to me, biologically, that doesn't make sense. It makes absolutely no sense when you look at the animal kingdom and the science and you see what God has done in those biological blocks, that all of a sudden I say God got stupid and forgot to block angels and humans cohabitating.
He holds to an open theism, so he doesn't actually portray God with foreknowledge of events.
He goes right back into the open theism issue. But I did want to point out again, though, that he kind of I mean, even there's a lot of debate about that passage. It's very, I don't mean the sons of God stuff. It's supernatural. Deal with it. That's the issue. But when it comes to other aspects of it, like the 120-year thing, lifespan, it could be read as a fire break, and saying, look, you're reaching for divinity. You're trying to become divine by this union. But I'm going to limit you to 120 years. So he's saying that God forgot to put these blocks? No, he put them. He gave us normal human lifespans, right? He didn't give us immortality just because of this union between the divine. Continuing on.
Events.
I don't want to misrepresent him, so I don't know if he had open theism or not.
I'm pretty sure he never came out bluntly to say it. But when you compare a lot of his expressions, he seems to very strongly imply it. Especially when he talks about autonomy of like Satan and demons and so on and so forth, the angels and so on and so forth.
It's just this sovereignty issue. Like he can't understand why God would give autonomy to other creatures. Like he can't tolerate that. It's very bizarre. And this reminds me of William Lane Craig, who's made this point about open theism and like the Augustinians, and saying that they make strange bedfellows because he's like, they both see Scripture the same way. Like when it comes to the sovereignty issue, both understand it the same way. They just go into different conclusions with it. And I think that's a good example of seeing that here. There's no reason why God can't give sovereignty. Like obviously in a lesser sense, we can't just flap our wings and fly away and do other things. But God sovereignly gives over some sovereignty to his other creatures. I don't know how that's difficult of a concept to grasp, but Tim Mackie.
Are you aware of a guy named Tim Mackie?
Tim Mackie, that does sound familiar.
Yeah, he worked with Heiser on that Bible project, I think it's called.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now you're ringing my bells. I remember.
Yeah. I had just become familiar with Tim. And I've noticed that they both went to that school in Wisconsin.
Oh, really?
Hebrew studies. Yeah. Tim Mackie and Heiser went to that same school. So not surprised that they're going to work together, right? On certain things.
In Genesis 19, when those two angels go to the city of Sodom and meet.
And by the way, his audio is just so much better. He's just mogging us with how much better his audio is than ours.
On certain things.
In Genesis 19, when those two angels go to the city of Sodom and meet up with Lot, they're quite physical. Lot tells them to come in, to his house, and then the men of Sodom come and want to rape the angels.
Another strange story.
So, and actually, we can talk about that more because the Sodom and Gomorrah story in Genesis 19 is designed as a perverted inversion of the sons of God and the women in Genesis 6, because it's humans and spiritual beings involving sex in a destructive way.
It is often inferred based on the Genesis 6 passage where it says they take to
playing this part by Henning, because he kind of goes off in a different direction. I mean, it's related, but he's actually kind of shooting himself in the foot. Not necessarily him, but some people would argue against the. They'll point out that in Genesis 6, it seems to put 100% of the blame on humanity, whereas you go to the Enochic Second Temple literature, and it seems to put a lot of blame on the supernatural. And here he's actually making the point that I think is true, that that language does not necessarily mean, now it can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it was coercive or forceful or anything like that. So in other words, it could be mutual. And if that's the case, then it's both the divine and the human mutually coming together. And again, why is humanity going off with the other supernatural, with the other gods? Is because, again, it's another grasp for divinity, just like Genesis 3, just like Genesis 11, the three falls that Heiser talks about. So Henning is actually making point for Heiser and the divine council stuff and all of that. Anyway, continuing.
Wives or whatever, that there was some kind of forceful aspect and even sometimes polygamy aspect going on here, where they took multiple wives to one angel, or the angel forced themselves on these women, and vice versa. Taking a wife is common idiomatic expression throughout the Bible for any man who takes a single wife.
He's saying that the men of Sodom want to rape the angels, but that's not what it says.
I think now I would have to go and see in broader context, which I didn't bother to look at. But I think Mackie could just be telescoping the story. That is, yes, it doesn't say that in the narrative, but we know it. And so that's why he's calling them angels, because we know that they're angels. And there is also, if you want to go in that direction, though, and I don't know if Mackie does, but you could argue, and people have, that in Jude 7, you have that, I can't remember what it says, strange flesh or different flesh or whatever. The question is, it's one of two things. It's either a reference to homosexuality, and that's what's different or strange about it, or it could be a reference to the fact that they knew they were supernatural and they went after, again, kind of like Genesis 6, they went after the supernatural entities. I think it's more the same sex issue, but either way, you could go in that direction, I suppose, if you tried to argue that. But continuing.
So I'm curious if Mackie actually represent Heiser's view accurately, because he's saying angels, 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 but Heiser's saying gods, gods, gods. And in that account, he's calling them gods. Heiser calls them gods. So I don't know if Mackie actually follows Heiser accurately.
I don't think you follow Heiser accurately.
And then my Hebrew teacher here in Portland had gone to the University of Wisconsin for the Hebrew and Semitics program. Where are you, Mike?
Your teacher was Carl, right? Carl Kutz.
Yeah, Carl Kutz. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, that's where you and I first met, although I was just like the entry freshman and you were the graduating like PhD.
Yeah, I was escaping.
You were, Mike, your dissertation defense was the first one I had ever seen in person. And I was terrified. Like, this is what I have to look forward to. And you were amazing, but they grilled you, man. Holy cow.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Brings back memories. I won't say fond memories, but
Mackie's very well aware of the distinctions that, again, Henning can't seem to make.
He'll tell you that Enoch is not canonical, but then, and I noticed this, and I think you noticed it too, he'll begin to use it as if it was.
Yes.
And I'm like, come on, Heiser. And I'm like, and the people that follow him, I'm like, you don't see the trickery that he's doing. Now, maybe he's not doing it on purpose, but it's like a trick.
Michael Heiser actually says that his worldview is best supported by the Book of Jubilee.
Jubilee?
Yeah, the Book of Jubilee.
He has a habit of doing this where it's like, there's like an element of truth to what he's saying, but it's like, not really. So like Heiser never says the way he said it. Now, what Heiser says in his dissertation is that Jubilee gives the fullest expression to this concept of the rulers, all this stuff. That's different than saying, oh, Jubilee, you want my theology, go to Jubilee. It's like, no, that's not what he was implying.
Yeah, his doctoral dissertation, page 161, he says, Jubilees 15:30 through 32 provides the fullest description of the worldview of Deuteronomy 4:19 through 20 and 32, 8 through 9, Daniel 10. So he says Jubilees actually is the fullest description of his Deuteronomy 32 worldview. The reason why is because it presents angels as rulers over Gentile nations. There is a lot of rabbinic literature, Jewish literature, Second Temple Jewish literature that provides that concept that angels were given to rule over Gentile nations. But my emphasis again, and this is where I question where Mackie is actually following Heiser or what, because emphatically, these texts are saying angels, not gods. And Heiser is emphasizing a polytheistic worldview. He's saying,
again, angel, job description, Elohim, place of residence. It's not as difficult as is making this.
These are gods. They're inferior gods to Jehovah, but they're gods and they're superior to the angels ontologically. He's very clear on that. I have a whole chapter in my book, Angels are.
By the way, he's trying to hand wave this and say, well, the other material you can read, we looked through that long list of early church and stuff like that. But even among them, they have this understanding. Many of them talk about archangels, for instance. They understand that there is hierarchy within the heavenly host. And so, again, they're not Hebrew speakers, so they're not using the term Elohim, but they're supernatural creatures anyway. Again, this is the Mote and Bailey fallacy. His fallen back, he's still not actually hitting the fact that they are supernatural.
For gods, and it's defining what Heiser's saying. He's not talking about angels. And so these texts are very clearly distinguishing.
Again, he's not talking about messengers. Okay? He's talking about Elohim. Again, he's not talking about Malachim. He's talking about Elohim. Okay. Again, everything is doing is English. It's English, 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 over and over. It's like, get into the actual terms.
They're not polytheistic. And so he's trying to construct, and remember, his worldview.
Neither is Heiser. Heiser is not polytheistic because the Bible is not poly-Elohimistic, okay?
Is based on the idea that in the liberal education that he received, they're taught that Judaism evolved out of polytheism and forsook polytheism and went to monotheism during the Babylonian captivity. His argument against that is that it continued polytheistically. It continued to polytheism.
This next section is just slimy. Like, I can see it in the transcript, what it's about to say. And it's like, no, because it's going, again, having more than one Elohim is not polytheism. We've beat this dead horse.
Theism into the Second Temple period until the end of the Second Temple period. So he's addressing that all the Second Temple period literature, First Enoch, Jubilees, the Dead Sea Scrolls, blah, 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 all of this stuff, he's claiming that all represents his polytheistic view. Jesus was teaching his polytheistic view. The New Testament represents his polytheistic view. So we got to remember that is the worldview that he's representing and mistreating and misquoting these sources that he's referencing. All of these Jewish views, all of these Jewish texts are representing angels. One of Heiser's view is that the demons in the New Testament are the departed spirits from the giants that died during the flood, the Nephilim.
Yeah, the Nephilim, I remember that.
And so the earliest text that we have that represents that view is actually the book of Enoch, First Enoch. So that's where he's incorporating something. I mean, you got to stretch any biblical text to try to justify that with the Bible. I mean, you would have to presuppose this is right and then go searching for a text that might confirm it throughout the Bible. And that's what we see.
One thing worth noting in this is, where do you think they got it from in the Second Temple, in Enoch? They got it from Scripture. Again, now you can disagree with their stretching of exegesis to get that, but they're reading the Old Testament. That's where they're getting these ideas from. Whenever people just discard Enoch, they're doing that. They don't seem to appreciate that. Where are they getting these ideas from? Because people do this, like with other things like the afterlife. They'll say, oh, well, this belief wasn't, this belief is more of a Second Temple belief or whatever. And it's like, okay, where did the Second Temple people get that idea? They got it from the Old Testament. So this is another one of those things where it's like, it does go back to the Old Testament. Yes, there's not a whole lot of passages to point to, blah, 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 whatever.
We see Heiser doing. That's what we see other people who would follow him doing. Yeah. You wouldn't just go to the Bible with a blank slate and be like, oh yeah, I come up with this theology all by myself reading the Bible.
And you know how a lot of people like to talk about peer review has to be peer reviewed, right? Like that's supposed to be something extra special. And I'm like, well, it depends. And then my question is, well, what did the peers say? You know what I mean? So I said that to myself about that. Okay, peer reviewed. Okay, so what did the peers of this guy say? And I found one of them, and I may put the article there.
When I first saw this, I was like, don't say Mark Goodacre, don't say Winger. I was like, please don't say that.
It was by this guy named, I have it here. His name's Mark Goodacre. He's at Duke University.
The reason why, if you don't know, is, I mean, this is old news. Heiser, in his podcast episode, actually, he has a whole episode on this, and he deals with it. This is when he says that Troy Martin, who responded back to Goodacre's article, says Heiser said that he ate his lunch. So it's like, yes, Heiser's very well aware of the back and forth between the two. And for them, this is brand new. It's like, oh, somebody responded. Yes. And it's like, yeah. And then he got responded to. Yeah. Troy Martin responded back, answered his objections. And I think Troy Martin won that exchange.
And he wrote an article, and I can put it in the description, and you can check it later. I can send it to you if you like. And he says, does perivoleon mean testicle? Okay. In 1 Corinthians 11:15, that's the name of his article. And it was in the Journal of Biblical Literature. So that's one of his peers. Okay.
Yeah.
And he was like, nope. I'm summarizing. He said, nope.
And again, it's worth pointing out that if they're claiming, in reversing Herman, Heiser only said that it referred to the woman's genitalia. So if the technical literature is actually claiming it's referring to testicles, you got a big contradiction here. I didn't read those. I didn't read Troy's original paper. I don't know what it says. I didn't ever look it up. He originally said, is he saying that word is...
It's funny because in another clip, I didn't realize it here, but point is, he actually, again, combats this head covering stuff, at least on some level. He at least implies that he interacts with it in his book. And I'm like, really? So you wrote about this issue and you didn't even read the original article? Like that was kind of wild to me.
Defined as testicle? Because if that's it, then Heiser's actually misrepresenting that article.
That is the title of the article. Again, he would know if he actually read the article.
All right, so I have congregation because that's how it's translated in the King James, right?
Mm-hmm.
Congregation. And for the most part, so he has Psalm 82, congregation. You see that? All right, so that's how the New King James translates that Hebrew word. And I was kind of joking with myself. I said, it's amazing that Heiser didn't turn Israel into a divine council.
By the way, I'd taken a lot of those minion clips out. You could do a drinking game with every time he plays that clip. The clip is just so ironic because he's saying he's surprised Heiser didn't turn the congregation of Israel into the divine council. Well, the reason that's so ironic is he's doing that in reverse. He's taking a council of gods. He's taking a council of Elohim and he's turning them into humans. He's saying, oh, these sons of God, they're in Genesis 6. They must be, I don't know, Sethites or something. I don't know what he does there. They did it with Deuteronomy 32. Well, it's clearly talking about Israel. They did it with Psalm 29, right? Again, no, clearly it's talking about Israel. They've literally done that in reverse. It's just wild to me. Now, the other thing that's worth noting, and I don't know, it might be going into this next clip, but he makes a big deal about the difference between congregation and council. Let me go forward a little bit.
But yeah, so I looked at that. I said, that's kind of strange that the ESV, it uses congregation, okay, for that same Hebrew word several times, but not Psalm 82 and 1, though.
So what? I mean, again, back to the Mote and Bailey. Is it, if it said God has taken his place in the, divine assembly, divine congregation in the midst of the gods he holds judgment, is that functionally different than divine council? Like, I don't know how that gets you out of the fact that it's a supernatural council. It doesn't. So at this point, we're just quabbling over translation and semantics, but it functionally is saying the same thing.
Heiser actually focuses on the word host, is the host, the heavenly host, he uses that term, these heavenly hosts, as the divine council. So it's interesting that he's not using the same word that he normally uses for that definition, where we look at the heavenly host and within context, sometimes the word host could be referring to angels. Sometimes it's referring, and most of the time is referring to like the stars and so on and so forth, or a host of men in an army or whatever. But he uses that word for the host, the heavenly host, referring to his divine council.
I'm actually curious. I didn't do this search, but I will after this. I'm curious how often it actually is like unambiguously referring to the heavenly host in the sense of stars, constellations, things like that. Because of course, you have these passages, the beginning of Zechariah, thus says the Lord of hosts, all this us, blah, 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 Lord of hosts. He uses that phrase a whole lot, especially at the very beginning of Zechariah. And of course, other prophets as well, especially latter prophets. Is he talking about constellations? Here's Yahweh with his entourage of this gas giant, this constellation, this nebula. No, it's talking about the heavenly host. Again, he calls them by name. It's not talking about some, Beetlejuice over there. No, he's talking about Michael and Gabriel. He's talking about the heavenly host. And so more often than not, I think, are getting that the heavenly host is the host of heaven. It's the angelic host. These are intelligent creatures. These are not just simply the objects that we see in the sky.
And, if he was consistent with his own thinking or use of words, he would have to assume that the word for congregation or council here should be that word for host, a divine host, not divine council or divine congregation. He shouldn't be using that word. So it's an inconsistency within his own thinking.
It is unique, that phrase. It's the council of El. It's the only time that this shows up. So it's unique anyway. So it's kind of like hapex legomena. You have to interpret there in the moment. You can't really bring up a whole lot of other text and say, well, we translate this way over here, whatever. But it's, and the context is going to drive whether it's supernatural or not. Of course, later down, I said you are gods. Oh, no, that must mean humans. So, whatever. This clip, I know why I included it. This is mostly because they, and again, I heavily edited it out. In fact, they go longer, or he goes longer in this, where he's just missing the fact that El is being translated as divine. And normally, whatever, who cares? But again, you're criticizing a guy's life's work. And this is highly technical stuff. You clearly don't have command on this material, which is fine. There's a lot of stuff I have no idea about. But I'm not going to go criticize somebody's life work in an area when I don't have command over the material. And it's just so obvious he doesn't, because he doesn't realize El is what's being defined as divine. And it's just like, I mean, if you've studied this, you would immediately know what's going on. And clearly he hasn't.
This is right here. That's El, right? That's in the congregation of El, right? That's not Elohim. And this right here is in the midst of Bikarev Elohim, right? In the midst of gods. But here it's like they totally forgot or left out of the ESV, the El. You know what I'm saying?
They're translating it with the word divine.
Oh, okay. Okay. That makes more sense. Yeah. I think this is a key verse. Okay. Verse 19. Then Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne and all the hosts of heaven standing by on his right hand and on his left. Now this is where Heiser, I believe, made his mistake, because this is a human being on earth and he says he saw the Lord. And my question is, how? Did the Lord come down and bring the heavenly hosts? Did he transport Micaiah up? Or is this some type of vision? But what we do know is that he did not see the Lord, in a normal sense, right? It can't be, because that's just not how it works. And so when I looked at that, I said, I saw the Lord say, this has to be something God showed him.
So they're going to appeal to Anthony Rogers later. So I'm going to tag him in here.
Because the Old Testament itself so often speaks of one person speaking to another and presents that other as a divine person who's being addressed, a person who already exists, because the prophet is often getting these words by means of being ushered into a throne room setting, being made privy to, granted access to the divine council, and hearing these conversations, because so often a prophet will record words spoken in the first person to another person, what the authors of the New Testament are doing is they're recognizing that this is also the backdrop, the original backdrop for many other statements of the Old Testament. Right? This is how the prophets would have originally heard many of the things that they're recording. All right, brief summary. In the Old Testament, you have many examples of conversations between persons, one person speaking to another. This reflects the fact that the prophet himself is overhearing these words being spoken because he has been ushered into the divine presence.
And just to kind of round things out here, in addition to that, we have passages like in Job 15:7, where it says, are you the first man? Of course, they're talking about Adam here, who was born, or were you brought forth before the hills? Have you listened in the counsel of God, and do you limit wisdom to yourself? So there's, again, this concept of listening into the counsel. We have in Amos 3:7, for the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, does nothing without revealing his secret, which I'm not crazy about this translation, because it's the same term, it's counsel, so, to his servants, the prophets. So God first, again, going back with Rogers, he invites up the prophet to the divine council, is ushered into the divine presence. We get this like with Ezekiel, we get this with Daniel in various places, we get this with most famously with Isaiah 6, where he goes, the seraphim are flying around, all that kind of stuff. So they go and they listen into the council. And the host here is acting like, what is going on here? Like this, what is this? There aren't passages where this happens. It's like, no, it kind of happens quite often. This is a well-known concept that many scholars know about and talk about. But just because Heiser was one of those and they don't like Heiser, all of a sudden this is anathema. We can't talk about this stuff. Okay, take two. My OBS crashed at this portion, so we'll try it again. And they're discussing the host of heaven language.
And it's also important to point out that that verse uses the word host of heavens. And like I just mentioned, it's not the same word Ada that we look at Psalm 82, but Heiser interprets hosts as referring to this divine council. And so his whole entire interpretation of this passage hinges on that one word.
They're acting as if this is like this impenetrable mystery that we can't possibly know what this phrase refers to in this context. And that's just kind of ridiculous. So really the crucial line here is in verse 19. And Micaiah said, therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, so on and so forth. But that's pretty obvious. I mean, you have the Lord in heaven enthroned. The host of heaven then would be what? I don't think it's gas giants. I don't think it's constellations. I don't think it's humans. That leaves you with what? It's supernatural entities. It's the heavenly host. It's angels, whatever term you want to use, although they're not angels because they're not delivering any message. Okay. So there's that. The parallel to this, I actually studied this out in depth because I went through Chronicles. Now, in chapter 18, it's mostly the same overall, but there was one note in this in chapter 18 that I wanted to point out that one of the commentaries picked up on. And so I think this is Klein here in his commentary, and his pointing out that there's kind of this mirroring thing going on with the mirroring councils, if you will. You have the heavenly one, then the earthly one. And so Klein wrote, the enthronement of the two kings by the threshing floor at the gate of Samaria is in ironic contrast to the enthronement of Yahweh in verse 18 and to the frenzied activity of the prophets here. The royal garments worn at the safe haven of Samaria are in contrast to the disguise that Ahab dons in verse 29. So you have this frenzied thing going on here on earth, this human council. And then that mirrors like the orderly council where the true decrees are actually happening, where Ahab's been decreed to die. And of course, the human council is saying, no, you're going to go win. Now, by the way, the host here, and I don't mean the heavenly host, I mean the Christian road warrior, he says that he believes that the lying spirit is actually Micaiah. And you can check out the live stream for his exegesis of that passage, but it's pretty out there. And yeah, the point is, though, that the heavenly host, the host of heaven, that language, it's not mysterious, especially in the context like this. If he's talking to them, he's not talking to constellations. He's not talking to stars. So to act like, and then of course it uses the language of spirits. I mean, what else would they be? And Henning never even takes a swing at what could possibly be going on. It just can't be what Heiser's saying. But we will continue.
What I see here is a what I would call an isolated incident, because I don't see anywhere else in Scripture where you see this kind of imagery of God asking questions of some people, beings around him. You know what I'm saying?
This is a common motif. He's just unfamiliar with this element of Scripture.
Right.
Because this seems to be specific to Micaiah, Ahab, in this situation, this historical context. Partially.
The only other passage I could think of off the top of my head is Job when he asked Satan, but it's definitely,
but I'm talking about a group of heavenly beings.
It's not the same as this.
No. In Job, the sons of God go along with the Satan, and then the conversation happens. So it's like, yeah, it actually is a very similar context to this
passage. Yeah. Heiser himself admits a selective hermeneutics. I believe he makes a comment in The Unseen Realm, so most of his fans have read that book. That's his most popular.
I think what he's talking about when he says this, the selective hermeneutic idea, is I think he's referring to early on in the book where Heiser gives a list of all these passages. And he's making the point that these are not just random passages, and they're actually all like kind of threading the same ideas of, again, the heavenly host, divine council stuff. And so, but he's not like filtering all of the Bible through these select passages and only these, forget about other passages. That's not what he's doing at all. He's just saying these things that are treated as just curiosities, strange oddities over there, they're actually part of the bigger puzzle.
Popular one. And so you have to understand right off the bat, he's not dealing with the whole counsel of God's word. He's selecting what passages he can make his doctrine fit. And he's trying to construct a convincing argument for it based on these few passages. I brush off this passage in my book. I don't, even though Heiser maximizes his use of this passage as often as he can, but I don't even deal with it because you got two words that go up in the whole passage that you could only interpret based on your presupposition: the host of heavens and the word spirit.
I mean, obviously it's talking about supernatural entities. I don't know how that's a difficult interpretive issue.
I was reading his other books and I'm like, he quotes himself in footnotes quite often.
Okay.
And so when I read the book Demons, which was published 2020,
that's very common in scholarship to do that. Andrei Orlov does that quite a bit. I actually like his work quite a bit too.
I started tallying every footnote that marks himself, and it was like 90 some footnotes in the book that were dependent upon himself. So it was almost, I think it was like 1/3 of all his footnotes in that book, or maybe 1/4 of it. I think it was like 1/3 or 1/4, somewhere around that, where all of his footnotes were depending on his own writing. And that's kind of an interesting thing. Like, it's one thing to reference yourself. Hey, I did a lot more thorough study over here. If you're interested in this topic, see all of
which is what it's doing.
The quotes that I provide over here, but he kind of like depends on himself as the authority for his own research because he keeps quoting himself to put a backbone and footnotes that look at how thorough researched I am. But
So I guess the bibliography was just for decoration.
he just keeps quoting himself. You know what I mean? Reversing Herming, I think I probably said this every time, was definitely the most far-fetched, way out left field, bad book he wrote. And it's interesting that all of the other books that I've read of him were published by Lexham, except for Reversing Herman. So I'm kind of curious why he got a different publisher for Reversing Herman. Did Lexham not want to publish that book, or what? I don't know. But
you could write Lexham and ask.
That's my suspicion. Like,
yeah, I mean, you could ask. They might. I mean, yeah, we thought it was a little far-fetched, and he's like, nah, you better go somewhere else with that. You better go somewhere else, Heiser, with that one.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but I'm just going to switch over tabs, and as you can see, Reversing Herman and Lexham Press, 2017. So I think what happened was initially he published with, I think he wrote it for a friend, and then he went through his publishing company, and then because he owned the manuscript, he then licensed it to Logos or to Lexham. They actually did go through Lexham. It's on their website. I mean, that's Lexham's website that I was looking at.
So it's his false gospel because if you got a problem with Trinitarianism, that's going to affect your view of salvation. If you don't,
that's crazy. I know of a number of people that their view of the Trinity has been strengthened by the two powers in heaven by Heiser's work, but so that's ridiculous.
Believe in a physical bodily resurrection, there is no salvation.
He just makes stuff up in this whole section.
If your idea of sin is wrong, then your idea of what needs to get forgiven and how's it going to be forgiven is going to be wrong. Also dealing with our ultimate and eternal destination, where he has this extreme Arminian view of you could, even after you get deified and have this eternal life glorified, you could still lose it. So there's really no eternality in his eternal life or everlasting life. So even his gospel, you can, at any time you can lose salvation.
No, we'll answer it here. But truth be told, I've answered this question many times, and I know we've had it more than one Q&A. The short answer is this is utterly implausible. Rebellion in the new earth is utterly implausible to the extent of it being impossible.
Yeah. You wait to slander him when he's dead. No, there are people who tried to contact Mr. Heiser, but Heiser, from what I can see, he had a habit of not really listening.
And I think his source for all this is Henning. He doesn't mention anybody else.
Well, not really responding in detail to his detractors. He kind of just brushed them off because from what I understand, he brushed you off as if,
Yeah, his response to me was, I'm illiterate. He basically mocked me and called me names and didn't answer.
I mean, on one hand, I think Henning here is like hurt by this, which is kind of understandable on one hand. On the other hand, I've seen people say that, Heiser was dismissive of him and whatever. I don't have a problem that he was dismissive of him because the article that he started the whole thing off with is that he's a Gnostic and is a polytheist. That was the title of the article, was Heiser's Gnostic heresy or something like that. So again, that puts you outside of the faith. I mean, I don't see why Heiser would then need to turn around and be charitable with him and walk him, hold him by the hand and walk him through all this stuff. It's like, and this was Heiser's point, just read the book and you're going to see this stuff is just nonsense. But whatever.
His response to me was, I'm illiterate. He basically mocked me and called me names and didn't answer anything that I brought up within my articles. And then the series of articles.
You don't have a doctorate in Hebrew, Henning, so you don't know what you're talking about.
So a lot of people say that he was a very gracious and sweet guy, and from my correspondence and his interactions with me and his response to my articles, I did not get that impression from him. I'm sure he's very nice to his friends and his loved ones, but he wasn't that nice to me. And I get where his character is reflected in a lot of his fans, where they're very vindictive individuals. From the emails I've had from a lot of his fans, I can get why if they're his fruit, I can get why they are the way they are, because the way he responded to me. I mean, I get he was probably angry at me because I'm criticizing him, but he could have actually answered respectfully.
I don't think it was the criticism. Again, it's just right out the gates, calling him a Gnostic and a heretic and a polytheist. That's why he responded the way he did.
You quoted Heiser about how he feels about the divine council. He spent so much time on it, and he felt that there's not a single doctrine that is untouched by the subject. Then you say, by these words, Heiser is expressing that either the entirety of Christianity has misunderstood all matters.
I mean, he's quite literally setting up an either-or fallacy
of theology for 2,000 years, or he's offering us some new theology that is altering every doctrine because of his divine council concept.
Or he's saying the divine council concept can offer more deeper, robust understanding of the doctrines we already believe and hold to. That's his point. It's not we're going to change everything. It's we're going to enhance in the sense of clarifying it. We're going to up the resolution so you can see these things clearer. It's not changing.
Mm-hmm.
You care to comment on that?
That's pretty much it. He often mentioned how he obsessed over the divine counsel, and his podcast was titled Naked Bible Podcast because
Right.
his premise for that title was he was stripping theology of Christian tradition, the traditional interpretation of stuff. So he was stripping Christianity from that. So he's literally trying to remove what historical Christianity has believed.
I just want to sort of prep you a little bit.
Now, before we listen to Heiser here, the naked Bible thing, it's so obvious. I mean, especially I find this odd coming from a Protestant, because the idea is Scripture is the authority. It's the final authority. Our traditions should be in service to that, to the biblical text, to the Word of God. If your traditions are biblically based, guess what? A naked Bible approach isn't going to hurt it. It's only going to help it. Now, if your tradition isn't supported by the biblical text, now you might start running into problems. I suspect that's actually what's going on. That like weird, to quote the Matrix, the splinter in their mind. I think what's that thing, that rock in their shoe, is that their tradition is not lining up with what Heiser's saying. But what Heiser is saying is just what the Bible is basically saying. Heiser was super conservative about a lot of this stuff. And I think that their tradition is coming up against Scripture, and they don't know what to do. And so that's why they feel this disconnect. But again, if your tradition is biblically based, you don't have nothing to worry about. You should be doing that. You should be filtering your tradition first, primarily through Scripture.
So he's literally trying to remove what historical Christianity has believed.
I just want to sort of prep you a little bit. Mike, you're not going to hear Mike say, well, you thought the gospel was A, and Mike says it's B. No. The things that you believe, I believe. I'm a normal, evangelical guy. I know what the gospel is. I accepted Christ as Lord. It's an exclusive claim. There is no other way of salvation. I'm a normal Trinitarian dude. Okay, all the boring things, I'm that too. But the reason why I think those ideas are coherent and arise from the text might be dramatically different than you've heard.
So you don't have a traditional Orthodox view of the fall of man, inherent in sin nature, and so on and so forth. You don't.
He says traditional Orthodox and then immediately pivots to Augustinianism. Believe it or not, there were Christians before Augustine that took a different view of those things. And there's an entire tradition that still doesn't take it that way at all. And I'm talking about consistently. Of course, you have newer people like Anabaptist stuff, and then even newer than that, like the provisionist types. People don't all see it this way. You're just, again, assuming circularly, you're assuming this tradition is the correct one. And Heiser's just not falling into that bucket that I want him to.
I have this. He's literally changed every aspect of every doctrine in our systematic theology.
Okay, prove that. Every aspect of every doctrine. Okay, this clip is funny to me because what they're going to do is they charge Heiser of like doing the appeal to authority thing. I'm the Hebraist. I know this stuff. You don't. You dirty peasants. You don't know this stuff. So listen to me, blah, blah, blah. They're going to then turn around and do the appeal to authority. There's other people that spoke Hebrew for longer than he did, and they don't agree with him, blah, blah, blah. It's just like,
Systematic
really?
theology.
There's been centuries of theologians before Heiser was born that have argued from the Hebrew that, yes, we're talking a foreshadowing of the Trinity. But Heiser comes along, gets his degree, I believe his doctorate from a liberal school in the 2000s, right? I believe he got his degree in the 2000s, right? He's like, wait a minute, he's a newbie to Hebrew. He hasn't been, my Hebrew professor at my school, my graduate school, he's been teaching Hebrew 40 plus years. Teaching. Not talking about he learned it, but just teaching 40 plus.
Again, this is my PhD is bigger than yours. My professor can beat up your professor. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yes. To me, there's a level of arrogance for Heiser to come along and act as if everybody before him is just wrong.
This is funny to me because this really is a demonstration of his ignorance of the scholarship in this area. Because Heiser is not new. Heiser is not saying everybody had it wrong before I showed up. No, Heiser was very much in line with what a lot of people have said. Now, you can disagree with some of the stuff like Genesis 1:26, the divine counsel stuff. They'll hit that later. But you can disagree with that. But that is a pretty common view in academia with a lot of these scholars. Now, again, it's dumb to do to count noses and say who has the most credentials and then go with that. That is an appeal to authority, which is what they're doing. But if we're going to go in that direction, trust me, you don't want to go in that direction. Because if we did that, if we start, saying, okay, who has the most credentials? Who's the most respected? Okay, what is their interpretation of Genesis 6 or Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32, or Genesis 126? Is it the divine council? Is it the Trinity? Guess what? You're not going to find these super credentialed modern scholars going in the direction that you want them to go in a lot of these passages. They're going to side with Heiser and almost all of this. So I don't think you want to go in that direction.
And one of the issues that we frequently find in Heiser is that he draws a very, very, very strict dichotomy between the Old Testament and New Testament, as almost they're two different books or two different authors. You know what I mean? Like he draws such a distinction between the two, like almost as if there's no valid connection between them.
That's just kind of ridiculous. But the one thing that I want to say, and Jordan Cooper kind of did a little bit of this in his critique, and I've seen other people do this, where they kind of have this like pious thing of we got to let the New Testament be the final authority. We got to let Jesus speak on some of these issues like Psalm 82 and his use in John 10. Of course, that sounds very reasonable, and I would ultimately agree with it. But part of that seems to be this underlying unstated assumption that there's somehow a disconnect between those two, which is ironic because they're saying Heiser's, separating the testaments. But again, I find that odd. If the New Testament is interpreting and not eisegeting the Old Testament, then understanding the Old Testament context is not going to yield a different interpretation to what you get in the New Testament. So you're seeing the same image from two different sides. So it doesn't actually create this like split testament thing. There's going to be continuity between the testaments. This next clip is pretty funty.
He'll still say, "Oh, it's not canon," and we don't treat it. But he'll treat First Enoch as if it is, because he uses it to as if it is canon.
Right.
He's always talking about the Watchers. That's not a biblical term. That's First Enoch, right?
Yeah. Well, it does show up in Daniel, but
like the word Watchers.
Yeah. It's I'm trying to remember Daniel 5, I think actually.
Again, I just want to make that clear. I don't consider, and the listeners who have listened to the podcast for a while, heard me on other outlets, know that I don't consider the book of First Enoch canonical. And I actually think that the question doesn't mean a whole lot, because if you consider the book valuable, you ought to read it, and it ought to inform your biblical study because it informed Peter and Jude's biblical writing. It doesn't have to be canonical to do that. Who cares? But again, we're doing the episode because I know a lot of people do care. But my view is that it's not in the canon, and it doesn't need to be. But I just want you to be aware that there are, again, early Christian sources that said, nope, should be in there. I consider the question kind of moot. I don't see a compelling reason to embrace Enoch as canonical. It doesn't matter to me that Jude, and Peter quote it, because biblical writers quote lots of stuff that we would not even for a moment consider canonical. When the psalmists quote the Baal cycle, I'm not thinking, I wonder if the Baal cycle should be in the canon. No. Again, the fact that something is quoted or something is paraphrased or something that the content of something is embraced and then re-articulated into a book that is inspired, none of those things are arguments for the canonicity of the thing being utilized or the thing being quoted. That argument simply does not work. You will go in very, very bad, theologically bad, awkward, ridiculous, and frankly contradictory places with that logic, deeply contradictory, especially with something like the Baal cycle. So it's a non-argument. I don't care if it's canonical. If I get to heaven someday and Tertullian walks up to me with Jesus and says, hey, Jesus has something to tell you. You were wrong about First Enoch. It really belonged in there. I'm not going to be disappointed. Okay, I'm going to say, oops, sorry, I was wrong. You were right. Let's enjoy eternity now in the global Eden. You won that one, Tertullian. I don't care.
And earlier in that particular episode, he's talking about how he, as an Old Testament scholar, like for him, this is just obvious because he has to deal with this stuff. He has to deal with the commonality, the connections, the touch points with ancient Near Eastern stuff, sometimes word for word, sometimes letter for letter, correspondences. And so it's like, okay, clearly the biblical material is interacting, polemicizing, correcting the theology of these other people, but it is interacting with it. And so because he knows that stuff's there, he also knows it's not an endorsement of everything in that document. Similarly, when he gets to the New Testament and he sees the New Testament interacting with Enochic material, he doesn't then need to baptize all of Enoch and say it's canon. That's his approach. That's why for him it's like this question is just kind of silly because we don't bring other things that Scripture interacts with, which is funny because they play another clip of another person basically making that point. I promise you, like I would never do a debate, but if I did do a debate, like on this, I'm already telling you now what I would do. One thing I would do with the Enoch thing, if this came up, I would have prepared a quote from Heiser talking about this stuff. And I would say, hey, this is what James White says about Enoch. And I would read it. And I'd be like, do you agree with that? And I promise they'd be like, yeah, that's how we should view this. And I'd be like, okay, just kidding. That was actually from Heiser. I promise they could fall for that because what he says is the same thing other people are saying. He's not, I don't, again, there's just so many of these issues. Anyway, this clip is also pretty funny.
And I know people say, oh, yeah, well, Jude quotes. Yeah. What does Jude quote? Does he quote anything about, Genesis 6, giants, Nephilim, and all that? No, he doesn't.
No. Now, on the one hand, you could go to Heiser's Jude commentary series that he did for the Naked Bible. I have it on my channel, like in one long video. And so, yes, there's a lot of touch points. But here, specifically verse 6, Jude 6, and the angels who did not stay with their position of authority, but left their proper dwelling place, he has kept in eternal chains and gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. And then he says here, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality. So what that's saying is these angels, they somehow indulged in sexual immorality. They did something that was sexually immoral. Which angels in the Bible, when did that ever happen? Genesis 6. That's what it's referring to, okay? And so that over here in 2 Peter, God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell. Of course, that's not actually hell. Click on this. It's Tartarus. Now, in Greek mythology, who's in Tartarus? The Titans, right? So it's connecting these concepts. He committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, and so on and so forth. He goes into preserving Noah. Again, he also brings up Sodom and Gomorrah. It's ridiculous to try to argue that there isn't this Enochic material here. It's clearly there. Again, it's just naivete to think that it's not there. And we're back to Anthony Rogers, and this is a lengthy clip.
This is Brother Anthony Rogers, great brother. Do you know of this guy?
No, the face doesn't look familiar.
He's criticized Heiser as well, and he's a good brother in the Lord. So just check out what he says here.
So he has to have some way of saying this isn't about the Trinity, but it is about angels, without saying that the angels have created us. So here's what Heiser says.
They're obviously talking about Genesis 1:26.
With respect to the grammar, okay? He says it's like somebody saying to a group of people, hey, let's get some pizza. And then the person goes out and pays for the pizza and brings it back for everybody to eat, right? In other words, while many people are addressed, let us get a pizza, only one person actually goes and gets the pizza and brings it back.
God, singular God, is speaking to a group. He's including them in the conversation for some reason, but when he actually gets down to doing what he said he was going to do, he's the one who does it.
Only one person actually does it, but he's addressing others. So God is addressing others, but they're not really to be involved in the work. I can show you as a matter of fact that every time that verb is used in the Old Testament, it always has reference to a plurality of personal subjects who are always, always, always involved in whatever is being spoken there.
That's
it's
right.
never one person saying this and one person doing this to the exclusion of the group that he's addressing.
All right.
And it's used, for example, in Exodus 19:8, where it says, all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, na'aseh, okay? Or we will make. It's an idiomatic way of saying we will do this, okay? Then Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. Now ask yourself the question, are the people saying, and would it have been accepted by God for the people to say, we will do this, all the words that you have spoken through Moses, when all they meant is one guy is going to obey your commands and the rest of us are going to disobey you? No, quite obviously, all of them are saying we are all going to do this, right? It's not one of us is going to go get the pizza, right? And the rest of us are going to make a molten calf. It's saying we are all going to do what you have commanded.
That last part was funny to me because that's literally what happens in the narrative. In fact, that them saying we will do these things, they're talking about the commandments, right? But what happens? One guy goes to get the pizza, aka he goes to get the law, the tablets of the law, and what happens when he leaves? The same people that said na'aseh, they go off and they make a golden calf. Like he got carried away with he got a little too cocky there at the end. But I do like the argument. I think this is a strong point, and I wish that commentaries actually interacted with this, because I've not studied out Genesis 1:26 in depth. Now, by studied out, I mean I've not pulled every single commentary that I can ever get my hands on, every dissertation, every article. That's what I mean when I say I haven't studied it. I mean, I haven't turned over every rock. Let's go ahead and run this search. Okay, so he brought up this na'aseh thing. Like I said, I think it's a good argument. I'd like to see it interacted with more in the commentaries and whatever. I mean, people bring up the term, of course, and discuss it, but I've not seen them like go into the way it's brought up. By the way, notice how it's beginning and ending here, like a giant inclusio in the first 11 chapters to the Tower of Babel. Now, there's only 60 of these, at least in this search I did. I maybe could have done a different search that would have yielded different results. And I haven't gone through like literally every single one, but I did, take a cursory glance through it. By the way, there's a lot in Ecclesiastes where it talks about things done under the sun. It's that language. And okay, so we could get pedantic with certain ones like this. So this is Jonah, and he says, let me take off the hover because that will get annoying. This is when the storm is happening, whatever, they're afraid. And they say to Jonah, what shall we do to you? Of course, the do here is, again, what shall we do? It's, again, this not a say language. And of course, Jonah tells them, throw me into the sea, blah, blah, blah. And they don't really want to do that, but ultimately they do here in, was it verse 14? No, verse 15. They picked up Jonah and threw him. Okay, so do we need to understand this as if literally every single one of them, this is like in Murder on the Orient Express, equally everybody grabbed an ankle, a foot, a hand, and they all together threw him in? Or is it just simply saying they agreed to do it, and then some of them did it? Like, in other words, did the person driving the boat have to go and also join in? Otherwise, it doesn't actually. It's like, I don't see it being that way. But like I said, that's a little pedantic. But we can find, I think, maybe better parallels to this. Let's see, which one do we want to pick on? There's a couple here that I actually think are pretty interesting. So here's Joshua 22:26. Now, again, what Rogers is saying is always, 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 it implies the people saying, let us do this, they're all involved in basically in the act itself or whatever. Okay, so this is in Joshua 22, towards the end. And this is the eastern tribes, Reuben, Gad, half tribe of Manasseh. And they start building this monument, this memorial. And long story short, it doesn't really matter for the purpose here, but they go and they're like, hey, what are you guys doing? They think that they're building an alternate sacred site. And they're saying, that's not what we're doing. We're just building this memorial thing for our future generations, blah, blah, blah. Verse 26. Therefore we said, let us now build an altar. Of course, this is not a say. Let us build an altar, not for burnt offerings, nor for sacrifice, blah, blah, blah. It's just going to be a witness, a memorial. But again, they say that, let us build, not a say. Are we to believe that every single person from the half tribe of Manasseh and Reuben and Gad, every single one of them, however many thousands of them, they all put hands on this stone to lift it up or whatever? No, I don't see why that would necessarily follow. It was for all the people, yes. So a couple of them made the pizza, but they all, joined in. I don't see how that, to me, what Rogers is doing is he's creating this hard line between this. Like, no, it absolutely involves everyone. And I don't see that. Now, maybe I'm missing something here. This is Manoah and the angel of the Lord. So this is Samson's parents. And it actually shows up earlier here too. Down here is the important one. Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, please let us detain you and prepare. Let us make a young goat for you. Okay. And the angel says, so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. So Manoah took the young goat with the grain offering and offered it on the rock to the Lord, to the one who works wonders. And Manoah and his wife were watching. So he says, let us prepare a young goat. So obviously they both prepared the goat, right? No, only Manoah prepared the goat. And then the wife here is watching when eventually the angel of the Lord goes up into the flame. So he says, let us do this, but only he actually does it. Oh, I thought always that they were involved. Again, unless I'm missing something, I don't know how that works. But Ahithophel, this one's, I think, a good example of this as well. So, and I want to say it shows up twice in this. Yeah. So this is David's on the run. Absalom has David on the run. And so then he asks Ahithophel, give your counsel. What shall we do? Again, not I say. There we go. Again, always, everybody's involved, right? Everybody's like doing the thing that they say, let us do. Okay, what does Ahithophel say to Absalom? Go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house. All of Israel will hear, you'll become a stench, and the hands of all those who are with you will be strengthened. Okay, so does Ahithophel go into the concubines as well? Or is he just telling Absalom to do that? He said, let us do this thing, but you're going to be the one that goes and does it. Further down in the narrative, similar kind of thing happens. In fact, here, Ahithophel is saying to Absalom, basically, let me do this. Let me choose these men, pursue David. You stay here. I'll bring them back to you. And Absalom then calls Hushai, who David has sent back to kind of be a spy. And hopefully you can turn the tides over there. He calls Hushai, asks for his advice. When Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom said, "Thus Ahithophel has spoken. Shall we do as he says?" Again, naaseh. Now, of course, is Absalom all of a sudden assuming that he is going to go pursue David? Is he assuming also, apparently, that Hushai is also going to go along with them? They're going to give him a spear and he's going to go fight too. No. He's saying, shall we do this thing? Again, just the normal way we would think, that it doesn't have to involve every single person together. It can be it can be like a group decision kind of thing. You involve other people in the decision-making process, but it doesn't necessarily mean every person is equally involved in the act. One more, let's just throw another one in here. In fact, the one that I found maybe most interesting was in Esther, because this one I think really severs the link. So this is the pivot of the book of Esther, where Ahasuerus, he can't sleep. And so they come and they're reading to him from the book. And this is where he remembers Mordecai. And so the king said, this is verse 3, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this?" So Mordecai does this great deed. What have we done for him? And then the king's young men who attended said, "Nothing has been done for him." Again, naaseh, both times. So Ahasuerus says, "What have we done?" And the young men say, "We haven't done anything." Both times it's this naaseh language. Okay. The point is, he's saying, has the court, has the kingdom done anything for this man? And again, I don't think these young men are on the planning committee. I don't think it's necessarily their responsibility. And they're saying, we haven't done anything, aka the king, the court, the kingdom hasn't done anything for him. And I don't think I'm reading this out of context either, because what immediately happens is Haman walks in. And so the king asks him as he walks in, "Hey, what should I do for the man I wish to delight?" Now, Haman thinks he's talking about him. So he's like, "Oh, okay, and he gets kind of carried away. He's like, let the royal robes be brought out to him, the king's robes, the horse the king has ridden, put a crown on his head, do all these great things for him, and let one of the best servants, one of your best servants, be the one that does all this stuff for him." And the king is like, "Great idea. You go do this for Mordecai." And so then he carries out, the stuff. Then he does it. So what do we do at the end of the story? What has Ahasuerus and the young men, what have we done for Mordecai? Well, it ends up being Haman is the one person that goes and does the stuff for the naaseh, right? Only one person ends up doing it. Like I just, again, the argument is, it's a good argument and it sounds really persuasive. But again, unless I'm just missing something, and I could be, I don't think it's as strong as Rogers makes it out to be, especially vis-a-vis the fact that we know the heavenly host is there in Job 38. And so, again, they could be involved in the creation in the sense that they offer worship to the Lord as he creates, kind of like you get in the Silmarillion. You get this in the Chronicles of Narnia as well. But the idea that they're kind of there, they're singing the song of creation as Yahweh does the work. And in fact, I actually asked two different people about this. I'm not going to name names, but two people that know Hebrew, speak Hebrew well. One of them is very credentialed, but I asked them about this, about this argument. And the thing that they both told me is they both basically said the same thing, independent of each other. And they were like, well, the problem is verse 27 is the two are part of the same unit. You can't really divorce them out. Not that like Rogers is necessarily trying to do that, but they do kind of draw, like the Trinitarian reading kind of does that in a sense that let us is persons of the Trinity. And then verse 27, the singulars are, I guess, the essence of God, singularly then creates. But by the way, it's not even the same word. It's not asa anymore. It turns into bara down here. It actually, again, changes the words and then changes them to singular. I have, for as long as I've known about this history, for years and years that I've known about all these discussions, I've always considered it a little bit of a both and. In concert with the rest of the polemical idea of Genesis 1, it's a lampshading of other creation stories where you have the heavenly host directly associated with the creation. And here it's saying, hey, remember that heavenly host idea, the divine council that you hear about in all these creation stories. Oh yeah, they're here. And then you switch to verse 27. This is where you think that some other deity is going to roll up their sleeves and get involved, right? And it's like, no, it turns to singulars and only one God does the creating. So I think they're drawing attention to it explicitly to dismiss the concept that the heavenly host was involved in creation. There are other ways we could talk about this stuff. So when I did the Psalm 8 video, I talk about this briefly. It's been argued by many that David has in mind verse 28. In Hamilton's commentary, he's talking about the connection between Psalm 8, Genesis 1:26, which a lot of people grant. A lot of people see it there. So Hamilton says that from what David says in verses 6 through 8 of Psalm 8, it is clear that he has Genesis 1:28 in mind. Now, personally, I would actually extend that back into the latter part of 26 into 27, because it actually is repeating a lot of the same language when it gets into 28. So all the language about the fish, the livestock, the creeping things, all of that's repeated in the latter part of verse 26. So in 128, and again, I would say by extension, verse 26 and following, God blessed the man and the woman, told them to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And then he granted them dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds in the heavens, and every living thing that moves on the earth. David works backward through the beast in the Psalm, in Psalm 8, 6 through 8, referencing the way that God put all sheep and oxen and all the beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven, the fish of the sea, under the feet of the man who stood over creation as God's representative. And this is actually very messianic, which I'll note here in a second. But if David has in mind all of this material here in verses 6 through 8 of the Psalm, what precedes verses 6 through 8 of the Psalm? Verse 5. Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, here in the ESV, but Elohim. What's right before this section that he has in mind in verses 6 through 8? Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So is it possible he has the heavenly host in mind? I think it's very possible. Like when you see the two side by side and the way David is tracking, I don't think it's a crazy interpretation. And what's especially interesting is in the New Testament, this gets applied obviously messianically to Jesus. Jesus was made a little lower than the angels for a time. And then after, the death, burial, resurrection, ascension, glorification, he then puts all things under his feet, which this gets quoted. In fact, this footnote might very well be to it. 1 Corinthians 15:27, for God put all things in subjection under his feet. There are other passages that talk about this. By the way, it's talking about destroying death. This is divine warrior activity. And so you have other texts that have this same thing, and it connects it to the humiliation, if you will, of the powers. Again, the other Elohim. It's not as crazy as people make it out to be. And I kind of hate this part of the discussion because I can actually, I sympathize with people that see the Trinity and only the Trinity. I can't go in the divine council area there. And it's like, I get that. But I actually think the argument's a lot stronger than people think. And you can still take a both and kind of approach as well, which I think that's very defensible as well. But we're nearly done, thank God.
Early to show that he is lying about what it's teaching. And this is often why I say he was a liar. All right. People might get upset with me saying that, but either he's lying about what it's saying or he's lying about having read it.
Because, or he might have just read it with those divine council glasses on, and it skewed his whole understanding. I mean, you say on page 240, he further asserts, contrary to the dominant Christian tradition, the fall of Adam is not the exclusive touch point for the depravity of humankind. Wow, I know Paul would have a problem with that, and a couple other people. Okay, but let me finish his quote here. Our study will show that New Testament...
The exclusive touch point, okay? It's like he didn't read that all the way through.
Theology is in concert with Second Temple Judaism that the human problem is not exclusively owed to Adam's transgression. The sin of the Watchers was also part of apostolic theology in this regard.
That's where he's going. I mean, he's saying that the idea of Genesis 6 is the issue of sin throughout the world. He's not subtracting the fall of Adam.
He would say that it was the proliferation of sin. It was expounding the sin problem and made it worse because they're teaching humanity self-destructive things that, again, just made humanity spiral further, harder, faster, all those things.
But he's minimizing it as if it's not a major issue. Okay, so this is why the chapter is called Heiser's False Gospel. What do we need to be forgiven of? The angels?
No, we need to be forgiven of our sin.
This is the kind of goofy conspiracy theories that are out there, because
this is the worst clip, and it's here at the very end.
His ideas. And, we're actually supposed to take dominion of the world and flush out these Nephilim that are ruining the world or something. You know what I mean?
To be clear, he's making it sound as if a big part of Heiser's teaching was that the Nephilim are a problem today. This is
Nephilim
what he's getting at.
Ruining the world or something. You know what I mean?
The Old Testament does make it quite clear that the giant clan lines were destroyed. That's the whole point of what happens with the Rephaim. The remnant there, flees to the cities of the Philistines. That's where we find them next. Goliath and his brothers are taken out. They're exterminated. We never get another reference to them. Even if you read the Septuagint, you have a reference to Enochim in Jeremiah, but it's a reference back to the Philistines. There's just no evidence for this. Zero in Scripture that we have a Nephilim presence beyond the Old Testament period.
This is where it's all leading to. It's not a matter of you personally sinned and need to find forgiveness by grace and faith through Jesus Christ, who died for your sins and rose the third day. This is the Nephilim issue is permeating society and is corrupting society, and we need to reverse that and take dominion. So he actually takes out the concept of even a need for the gospel. His definition of...
It's just crazy he says that right on the heels of saying that Heiser is a liar. I mean, come on.
Spiritual warfare is evangelizing his divine council theology worldview. So we need to...
No, he was saying, Heiser would say that spiritual warfare is basically preaching the gospel.
Tell everybody this is what's going on. We need to get everybody on board to counteract and reverse the damage that these Nephilim that are, destroying our society. That's what's going on. So the spiritual warfare is telling everybody about this divine council theology, evangelizing them into this, cultic belief. And that's how we're going to reverse the effects that came from Herman. It has nothing to do with the gospel of Jesus Christ dying for your sins.
It's just wild to me how someone can just, with such a straight face, completely misrepresent the life work of someone else. Like, oh my goodness. And here I kind of left these in. This is when Rob from Sentinel Apologetics shows up. And I left a couple of these because they're kind of funny. They're funny to me.
Do you know why he's saying that in that particular 2007 paper?
Yes.
Why?
Do you know why? Because he rejected...
No. Yes, I guess I do. So the question is, why did he write that paper? What was the origins of that paper particularly?
I don't remember off the top of my head. Yes. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Are you aware of the slot categories, like the binatarian slot category of
I do vaguely remember something about that, yes. But
this is funny because this is the context of the quote that he's about to read. Is kind of the two powers in heaven kind of stuff. And so he's like, I kind of, whatever. Let me take this quote out of context. It's basically what just happens in this clip. It's crazy.
Are you aware of the slot categories, like the binatarian slot category of
I do vaguely remember something about that, yes. But the point is, he says Yahweh the Father is the visible Yahweh the Father. So he's calling the Father visible.
He just completely misreads that quote. Later on, he will actually read it like the way it shows up, but he misreads the quote.
John chapter 1 says, no one at any time has seen the Father. He then goes on to say, this is not modalism. He's not presenting modalism, but he is.
Okay, let's take a look at that, though. Now, unfortunately, in the actual interview itself, Rob was on the phone. I think he was talking on the phone. And then later, he's like, let me get on the computer. Because after he said that Heiser said this, he was like, Heiser doesn't believe that Yahweh the Father is the visible Yahweh the Father, what he read or whatever. And then when I went and looked at the article, I was like, okay, yeah, I would have read this and not thought twice about what it says because it's not the way he's presenting it. But moving back just a little bit, there are other hypostasized agents of Yahweh, such as the name, the hidden glory in the cloud, the wisdom, but these figures are never seen and never appear as a human form. My Godhead within the council idea must include them in some way, and so I parse their status with the above co-regent figures as follows. In the Hebrew Bible, we have Yahweh the Father. Now, this would be like, again, the unseen, no one's seen the Father, what he quoted in John. So that's one. We have Yahweh the Father. Two, we have the visible and at times corporeal essence of Yahweh the Father in human form. In other words, Christophanies. That's basically what he's getting at here. Three, the visible essence of Yahweh the Father. Again, Trinitarians believe in three persons, one essence. So he's not saying anything that's contra Trinitarianism. The visible essence of Yahweh the Father that is not in human form. The angel, the word, the glory man all appear in human form. The name, for example, does not. Rather, the name can be linked to the non-humanoid cloud that fills the temple, the place Yahweh put his name. The same is true for the hidden glory. So sometimes you have appearances, manifestations of God's essence, but it's in like a pillar of fire. It's in, the burning bush or something. It doesn't necessarily have to be humanoid in appearance. So it's saying you have the unseen Father, you have the seen humanoid figure. Again, these Christophany kind of things where it's actually an appearance of a man-like figure, Ezekiel 1. And then you have just generic appearances where it's some kind of thing, pillar of fire, a cloud, whatever. So once again, this is the problem you have when you just simply are reading stuff to find something to object to. It's not a way to do honest discussion. But we'll continue.
No, I before I read Heiser, I was reading a lot of critical commentaries by critical scholars like John Day.
Okay, so you're reading a bunch of liberal garbage?
No, I wouldn't call it liberal garbage. Like this is,
wait, let me do this.
no, I wouldn't call it liberal garbage.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, there are conservative scholars that have endorsed Heiser's work. Like when you look at Tremper Longman III, John Walton, Ben Wedrington.
There's a whole lot of theological issues with those guys.
Do you actually
watch this
read,
clip in
say, the
normal
Bible
speed
in its original tongue in your devotions?
I do read Greek and Hebrew. 118, Theon Udes, Erakan Popote, Ha Monogenes Hoyas, Ha On Eistan Kalpan Tu Patros, Ekanos, Ekegersata. Sorry, it's very small print.
Do you believe you'll see Heiser in heaven as a brother?
I can't answer that. I believe he might, but I can't answer that absolutely.
Because I can say with a certainty I'll see you both and Heiser, and we can all have a big laugh. So
it's possible. I'm not saying Heiser wasn't saved. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just simply saying Heiser has made some mistakes in his interpretation.
And I think that's all the clips. I'm sorry. I feel sorry for Rob going on there. He's too smart, not for his own good, but for people sometimes. I think sometimes can't communicate all of the things that are in his head to people that are just not following. And it's got to be frustrating. I imagine there are some good critiques somewhere, but again, these are not the critiques you're looking for because there's just not a lot to it. Again, I'll make sure that I post the some of the resources and stuff like that, the quotes and collections of that kind of stuff, so you can take a look at that. But that's about all for this time, and thank God I'm done with this. Like I said, I think now that I've finished it, I can just tap out and be done with this, and we can get back to more positive presentations of things. But I think that's all for this time, and I will see you guys later. Although this clip is pretty funny. It's somewhere in here.
Dude, Deuteronomy 4 is not talking about any divine beings. You got to be kind of, what was it? There was a comedian that said something like a special kind of stupid, not just a special kind of stupid to actually read that and come away with divine beings. I mean, come on.